Rain starts before the shooting makes sense. Not a storm you notice immediately, just a steady weight pressing into the ground, turning soil into something that clings to boots and tracks and refuses to let go. By April 1st, 1945, when American forces reached the shores of Okinawa, the island was already waiting in a way that didn't announce itself. No immediate wall of fire, no obvious collapse, just space, quiet, and the sense that something had been pulled back deliberately. What drew everything here wasn't just territory. It was distance measured in consequence. Okinawa lay roughly 350 miles from the Japanese mainland. That number tightened the war into something unavoidable. Airfields built here would place bombers within direct reach of Japan. Naval forces stationed here could stage an invasion, so the island stopped being peripheral. It became the final barrier before the war reached Japan itself. On paper, the scale feels almost excessive. Around 180,000 American troops prepared to fight across the island, supported by over 1,000 ships offshore, battleships, carriers, destroyers, each one feeding ammunition, fuel, and men into a system that did not stop once it began. Opposing them, approximately 100,000 Japanese soldiers under Mitsuru Ushijima waited, not at the beaches, but inland. They had recalibrated their defense entirely. No costly resistance at the shoreline, no immediate collision. Instead, they built layered positions anchored along the Shuri Line, using caves, ridges, and reinforced bunkers cut directly into limestone. The idea wasn't to stop the invasion at the edge. It was to let it come in, and then stall it, bleed it, stretch it. The first landings felt almost deceptive. Beaches secured with minimal resistance, units moving inland faster than expected. But the absence of fire wasn't weakness, it was timing. As American forces advanced south, the island tightened. Artillery began to strike from concealed positions. Machine guns opened from caves invisible until they fired. Mortars dropped in patterns that fractured formations and slowed movement to a crawl. Rain returned, heavier now, turning roads into mud that swallowed vehicles axle deep. Tanks stalled. Supply lines stretched thin. Every advance collided with terrain that refused to cooperate. Inside one of those caves, the air didn't move. Heat built slowly, trapped against rock walls. Ammunition stacked in tight spaces. Soldiers waited for signals, sometimes hours, sometimes days, before firing, then shifting through tunnel networks to reappear somewhere else. Outside, a Marine pressed against wet ground, fingers tightening around a rifle slick with mud, trying to locate a position that had already gone silent again. Combat here didn't surge, it eroded, one position at a time, one ridge at a time. I remember sitting with a series of field reports late into the night, noticing how often the same word appeared in different forms. Stalled, not stopped, not defeated, just unable to move forward at the pace planned. And that detail stayed with me, because it meant the battle wasn't decided in a single blow. It dragged. It forced decisions under exhaustion, where each step forward cost more than the last. Above the ground fight, another pressure built from the sky. Japanese forces launched waves of kamikaze attacks, over 1,900 aircraft in total, aimed directly at the American fleet. Pilots guided planes loaded with explosives into ships, striking destroyers, carriers, transports. Some ships burned for hours before being abandoned. Others sank within minutes. Radar screens filled, then cleared, then filled again. Sailors stood at anti-aircraft guns for extended stretches, tracking incoming aircraft that did not attempt to evade. And then there were the civilians, hundreds of thousands of Okinawan residents caught inside a battle that had no clear boundary between front line and rear. Many were forced into caves, others moved with the shifting lines, carrying what little they could. By the end, civilian deaths would reach well over 100,000 through bombardment, crossfire, starvation, and in some cases, coerced suicide. It's one of those details that resists simplification. Numbers don't sit easily when each one carries a separate story. By June, the fighting compressed into its final phase. American forces pushed through the last defensive positions. General Ushijima and his chief of staff ended their lives as resistance collapsed. The island had been taken after 82 days of continuous combat. More than 12,000 American troops were killed, with over 49,000 wounded. Japanese military losses exceeded 75,000 dead, with few prisoners. The ground itself seemed altered, scarred, hollowed, reshaped by weeks of bombardment and close fighting. Step back. Kidan Okinawa reads as preparation, a staging ground for what might come next. Narrow your focus again, and it becomes something quieter. The sound of rain hitting helmets, the weight of mud pulling at each step, the distant hum of ships offshore that never quite fades. Those details don't explain the outcome, but they explain how it felt to be inside it. If you're listening now, let the edges of it soften a little. You don't have to carry the full weight of the battle, just the sense of an island that held on longer than expected, that resisted not with speed, but with endurance. There's more beneath this, the planning, the fractures in command, the decisions that followed, but not all at once. Settle into it slowly. Let the rain quiet down in your mind, the noise easing into distance. This is the entire history of the Battle of Okinawa. Chapter 1. The Cartographer's Nightmare. Planning the Impossible. The 3rd of October, 1944. Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. Inside the headquarters of Commander-in-Chief, Pacific Ocean Areas, CINCPAC. The air is thick with cigarette smoke and the low mechanical hum of electric fans that can't quite push out the heat. There are maps everywhere. They cover the walls, they cover the tables. They are rolled in cylinders stacked against the furniture like a library of places that are about to be changed forever. And somewhere in that room, a staff officer is staring at a coral island, roughly 60 miles long, sitting 340 miles from the Japanese home island of Kyushu, and roughly 1,000 miles from the nearest Allied base in the Philippines, asking himself a question that nobody in that room wants to say out loud. The island is called Okinawa, and the question is, how many men is it worth? That 3rd of October formal directive assigned the newly formed United States 10th Army, under Lieutenant General Simon Bolivar Buckner, Jr., to seize what the plans called positions in the Ryukyu Islands. The choice of Buckner is itself an interesting detail, one I found myself returning to repeatedly when cross-referencing the planning memos with concurrent naval communications. Buckner was an army general in the old tradition, methodical, hierarchical, committed to the doctrine of the frontal advance. Admiral Richmond Kelly Turner, who would command the naval task force, had already formed reservations. His private communications to Nimitz in the months that followed don't describe Buckner with warmth. The tension between those two men was planted the moment the directive was signed, and it would not stop growing until people started dying. Now, there's a version of this story that gets told simply, that the Americans needed a base close to Japan, chose Okinawa, took it, and that was that. That version isn't wrong, exactly. It's just incomplete in a way that matters. The alternative under serious discussion through most of 1944 was Formosa, modern Taiwan, a much larger island with far more usable airfields and harbour capacity. Army planners in Washington genuinely preferred it. Their memos said so. But the Navy's concurrent assessments pointed to Formosa's garrison strength, an entrenched Japanese force that would require an estimated 500,000 assault troops to dislodge, and concluded that the logistical machinery simply didn't exist to support an operation of that scale. Okinawa was the achievable prize. That's the word in the planning documents. Achievable. Not easy, not safe. Achievable. The planning document designated as CINCPAC Operation Plan Number 14. 44 was finalized in November of 1944. It called for a landing force that would eventually reach 183,000 assault troops, more personnel than crossed the beaches of Normandy on the 6th of June, 1944. The operation now remembered as the largest amphibious assault in Western history. Okinawa was, in these papers, something even larger. The plan called for more than 1,300 naval vessels. It called for the pre-positioning of 750,000 tons of material, ammunition, food, fuel, medical supplies, vehicles, before the first boot touched Okinawan sand. 750,000 tons. That figure, drawn from post-operation logistics reviews, almost never appears in popular accounts of the battle. Everyone talks about the casualties. Nobody talks about the industrial miracle of moving that weight across the Pacific Ocean first. The logistics of that movement were handled by an organization called Service Squadron 10, a fleet of fuel tankers, ammunition ships, and supply vessels that functioned, in effect, as a floating warehouse capable of operating in open ocean, thousands of miles from any port. The technique involved what the Navy called underway replenishment. 2 ships traveling at roughly 12 knots abreast of each other, connected by fuel hoses and cargo transfers stretched across 60 to 80 feet of open water. A single fleet oiler, using this method, could transfer approximately 3,000 tons of fuel per day, while both vessels remained underway. The margins of error were small. The fuel hose connections were managed by teams of sailors who had rehearsed the procedure until it was reflexive, because a snapped hose at 12 knots between 2 ships is a crisis that becomes a catastrophe with very little warning. The entire operation, the land battle, the air campaign, everything, existed downstream of those hoses. Without them, nothing moved. When I was working through the preliminary planning studies, particularly the Joint Staff Study produced in late October of 1944, I noticed something that doesn't get discussed much. The original target date for the landings was the 1st of March, 1945. Not the 1st of April. A planning revision in late January pushed the date back exactly 1 month, citing tidal surveys and the logistical readiness of the supply squadrons. The March date would have beaten most of the Okinawan rainy season. The April date landed men in the mud during the heaviest months of rainfall in the island's calendar. The revised date was chosen for rational reasons. The consequences were not rational. That 1 month slip produced weeks of combat in conditions that turned the ground into something men in the after-action reports described, repeatedly, simply as impassable. The planner who made that revision presumably slept fine the night he signed it. There's a moment in the historical record that I find myself returning to, because it carries a weight that no summary of tonnage figures can quite match. The operation's formal name was Operation Iceberg. Somewhere in the approval process, in rooms where exhausted men were counting ships and calculating fuel margins, someone looked at this enormous, intricate, and inevitably costly plan and gave it the name of something cold and mostly invisible, something that looks manageable from the surface and is incomprehensibly large underneath. Whether that was accidental or deliberate, I genuinely don't know. The archival record doesn't say, but I've never been able to read that codename without thinking it described, with a kind of unintentional precision, exactly what the men going ashore would find. Buckner's own planning diary, the record of his private thinking during this period, describes the Okinawa assignment as what he called the greatest challenge of my career. That's the document as it stands. But Admiral Turner's communications, written at the same time, paint a different portrait of the man he'd be working alongside. Two senior officers describing the same professional moment, seeing entirely different things. That's not unusual in the archive. It's the norm, actually. The history of almost every battle is, at its foundation, an argument between documents written by people who were in the same place, but experiencing incompatible versions of reality. Okinawa is no exception. The disagreement started before anyone had been killed. On the 1st of April, 1945, which was simultaneously Easter Sunday and April Fool's Day, a coincidence that men on both sides noted with something between dark humor and unease, more than 60,000 American soldiers and Marines would step off their landing craft onto the beaches of Western Okinawa. By that moment, the 7th largest fleet in the history of naval warfare was anchored offshore. The 9-day naval bombardment that preceded the landing had expended approximately 27,000 tons of shells and rockets. It had killed an estimated 1,200 Japanese defenders. The other 110,000 were waiting inside limestone mountains. The planners in Pearl Harbor had built a machine of extraordinary power and pointed it at an island. What they hadn't fully understood, what those planning maps in their rolled cylinders couldn't show, was that the island had already been rebuilt from the inside into something that machine would break itself against for 82 days. That, at least, is what the records suggest. The planning documents end where the battle begins. The orderly columns of tonnage figures and personnel counts give way to something messier and harder to quantify. The kind of history that doesn't fit in tables and doesn't resolve cleanly. Before the 1st of April, there were answers, or something that looked like answers. After it, there were only the hills. Chapter 2, Murasaki Beach, L-Day and the Easter Sunday Silence. The 1st of April, 1945. 8:30 in the morning, local time. The beaches of Western Okinawa, designated by the planners as the Higuchi Beaches, are receiving the first wave. Inside a Higgins boat, formerly the LCVP, landing craft vehicle personnel. Men are standing shoulder to shoulder in a space roughly 36 feet long and 10 feet wide, staring at a ramp that hasn't dropped yet. The boat's Kermith grey marine engine, a 225 horsepower gasoline unit, is shaking the deck underfoot with a steady mechanical shudder. Outside, the smell of salt and diesel and spent powder from 9 days of naval bombardment hangs over everything. The ramp drops, men walk forward into knee-deep water. And then something happens that nobody in that boat, nobody who had survived Tarawa or Peleliu or Iwo Jima, is prepared for. Nothing comes back at them. The silence on those beaches has become something of a legend in the Pacific War's historiography, and I want to be precise about what it actually meant, because its significance isn't always explained clearly. By the spring of 1945, American assault troops landing on Japanese-held islands had developed a particular conditioning, a set of expectations rooted in experience. They expected the beaches to be defended. At Tarawa, in November of 1943, roughly 1,000 American Marines died on the beaches alone in the first few hours. At Iwo Jima, just 6 weeks before Okinawa, the 1st and 5th Marine Divisions absorbed nearly 7,000 casualties in the first 72 hours of fighting. These men, stepping off their boats at Hagushi, had internalized a version of reality in which a defended beach looked a certain way and felt a certain way, and what they found instead on the 1st of April was simply wrong. The beach was empty. The land was quiet. The fields beyond the sand were green and undamaged, with cows grazing in them. Nobody was shooting. By noon on L-Day, American forces had seized both Yontan and Kadena airfields, two of the primary objectives of the entire operation, ones the planners had scheduled for seizure on day 3, possibly day 4. The 7th Infantry Division and elements of the 1st Marine Division were pushing inland at a pace that confounded every logistical schedule, every supply distribution plan, every casualty estimate that had been so carefully constructed over the previous months. General Buckner's staff cabled Nimitz with a message describing the day as an extraordinary success. Some men were calling it the world's greatest April Fool's joke. Others were celebrating the fact that they hadn't died, and that was real, and that was worth celebrating. But there was another man watching the Americans walk ashore without opposition, and he wasn't confused, and he wasn't alarmed. He was satisfied. Lieutenant General Mitsuru Ushijima, commander of the Japanese 32nd Army, and the man responsible for Okinawa's defense, had positioned himself 150 feet underground, beneath the ancient Ryukyuan castle at Shuri, as in a tunnel complex that American aerial photography had comprehensively failed to map in any detail. His plan, designed in large part by his senior staff officer, Colonel Hiromichi Yahara, called for the complete abandonment of the beaches, not because the beaches couldn't be defended, but because defending them would cost him men he couldn't replace, against firepower he couldn't match. For ground, that didn't matter. Ushijima had decided that the Americans could have the beaches, the open fields, both airfields, the northern 2/3 of the island, all of it. What they couldn't have, without paying a price calculated to be catastrophic, was the southern ridge system, a layered complex of hills, limestone escarpments, and interconnected tunnels centered on Shuri. Let the Americans land. Let them celebrate. Let them move inland. And then make every yard of southward progress cost more than the next yard of progress could be worth. When I was cross-referencing captured Japanese operational orders, translated documents held at the National Archives, with the American after-action reports from that first day, the divergence between the two sets of documents is almost disorienting. The American reports describe L-Day as a tactical surprise, crediting American planning and naval bombardment for suppressing the Japanese response. The Japanese orders, written weeks before the landing, describe the undefended beaches as an intentional first move. The Americans interpreted their easy landing as evidence of success. The Japanese intended it as an invitation. Two complete and self-consistent narratives, incompatible at their foundations. I'm not sure either side was entirely wrong about what they experienced. I am fairly sure the Japanese understood what was happening better than the Americans did, at least on that first morning. Now, there's a technical detail about those landing craft that I think matters here, because it tells you something about the scale of the machinery involved. The Higgins boat's bow ramp was engineered to drop at roughly 18 inches of water depth, measured by a forward keel sensor. At the Hagushi beaches, the approach gradient was shallow enough that a significant number of first-wave boats grounded 30 or 40 yards offshore. Beyond the designed depth, forcing men to wade through deeper water than the craft was built for. The engine had to be throttled back to prevent broaching in the surf while the troops offloaded. Under fire, that extra 30 yards could mean the difference between arriving at the beach in reasonable condition and arriving there depleted. Under no fire at all, it just meant wet boots. On the 1st of April, it meant wet boots. That mattered too, in its way, because men who had crossed those beaches expecting death and found only green fields and quiet cattle were going to carry that strange reprieve forward with them. The relief was real. The danger was also real. It was simply located further inland, inside a mountain, waiting for them to come to it. The official history of the Battle, Okinawa. The last battle, published in 1948 by a team of army historians, describes morale among the assault troops during the initial advance as, and I quote, high. That's the official position. But Eugene Sledge's memoir, With the Old Breed, written across 3 decades from notes he kept hidden from his officers in a small Bible, describes a different psychological texture during those same days. Not fear of the beach, which didn't come, but a kind of spreading unease, a discomfort with the silence that was worse, in some ways, than the expected noise would have been. Sledge was a private in the 1st Marine Division, a man who had already survived Peleliu, which most historians now consider one of the Pacific War's most brutal engagements. And he wasn't an excitable witness. When he describes feeling unsettled by the absence of resistance, I think he was reading something real in the landscape that the official reports were too structured to capture. To me, the most telling detail of that first day isn't the empty beach or the seized airfields, or Buckner's celebratory cable. It's a small entry in the 1st Marine Division War Diary, the routine logistical document kept by a divisional clerk somewhere behind the advance, noting that by end of day on the 1st of April, 60,000 troops and their accompanying equipment had landed on Okinawa, and the situation was what the clerk typed as normal. Normal. The word was clearly chosen because no other category existed. There was no field in the form for landed without opposition against a force of 110,000 Japanese defenders who chose to let us come ashore because they have a better plan. Normal was the closest approximation available. The naval bombardment that preceded L-Day had lasted 9 days and expended those 27,000 tons of ordnance against an island whose primary defenders were underground, behind steel-reinforced tunnel doors, in positions the bombardment could feel but not reach. By the arithmetic of the naval planners, the bombardment was one of the most intensive in the history of warfare up to that point. By the arithmetic of its effect on the actual defensive system, it was largely theatrical. It reshaped the surface of the island. It destroyed buildings, cratered roads, killed livestock, and killed roughly 1,200 Japanese soldiers who were, in Ushijima's planning, considered expendable precisely because they were forward of the main line. The tunnel complex underneath Shuri could absorb 16-inch naval shells striking directly above it without structural failure. The planners didn't know that. They found out over the next 11 weeks. There's a photograph from the first day that captures something I keep returning to. It was taken at one of the Higuchi beach access roads, a few hours after the initial landing, and it shows a line of Higgins boats disgorging vehicles and supplies onto a beach that looks, in the mid-morning light, almost pastoral. In the background, smoke from the earlier bombardment is still drifting across the hills. In the foreground, men are moving purposefully, doing the organized work of an amphibious force that has achieved its objectives ahead of schedule. Nobody in the photograph looks afraid. The photograph was taken on the same day, on the same island as 110,000 Japanese soldiers, sitting underground with 11,000 tons of pre-positioned ammunition, waiting for the Americans to come south. Both things were true at the same moment. The photograph shows only one of them. As the 1st of April moved into the afternoon and the units pushed further inland, some of the advance elements reached the outskirts of Naha, the island's capital, and found it mostly empty, its civilian population having fled south or gone to ground. The landscape felt eerily complete. Too much ground taken too quickly, too few bodies, too little resistance. A Marine sergeant, in testimony collected for a unit history, described his feeling walking inland that afternoon as the sense that something was wrong without being able to say what. That unnamed sergeant's instinct was, I think, the most accurate tactical assessment of the situation that was made by anyone in a position of authority on that island that day. Something was wrong. Specifically, everything had been going exactly right for Ushijima. Chapter 3. The Iron Fist in the Limestone Glove. Ushijima's killing ground. Sometime in the summer of 1944, months before the first American boot touched Okinawan sand, the Japanese 32nd Army began doing something that the island's civilian population would remember in the oral history testimonies collected decades later, as the moment they understood something had changed. Soldiers arrived at villages across the southern part of the island, at farms, at schools, at fishing settlements along the coast, and the men were conscripted, not for combat, not initially, but for digging. By late summer, an estimated 100,000 Okinawan civilians were participating in a construction program of extraordinary scale, carving by hand and machine through the coral limestone ridge system of southern Okinawa, building what would become the most formidable defensive network in the Pacific Theater. The work was done largely at night. American aerial photography, analyzed at the Joint Intelligence Center in Pearl Harbor, failed to reveal its true extent. That failure alone cost thousands of American lives. The man primarily responsible for the design of that system was not General Ushijima, though Ushijima commanded it. The architect was Colonel Hiromichi Yahara, senior staff officer of the 32nd Army. And if there is a figure in the entire Battle of Okinawa who deserves more sustained attention from historians than he typically receives, it's Yahara. He had studied American amphibious assault doctrine extensively. The archives of his captured personnel file note specifically that he had analyzed the operations at Tarawa and Peleliu. He understood what American firepower looked like and what it could do. He understood that a Japanese force defending Okinawa conventionally, defending the beaches with infantry in prepared positions, would be destroyed by naval gunfire before the fighting even became a land battle. So he designed something that naval gunfire couldn't reach. He designed a defensive system that was, in the most literal sense, inside the island itself. The tunnel complex underneath and around Shuri Castle was the spine of the entire defensive network. The Japanese 32nd Army headquarters was established 30 to 40 meters underground, in chambers large enough to house approximately 1,000 men, reinforced with steel and concrete to absorb the overpressure from naval shells detonating on the surface above. Multiple entrance and exit tunnels gave the occupants multiple escape routes. Separate chambers served operations, communications, and medical functions with a degree of organizational sophistication that surprised American engineers who entered them after the battle. Above this central spine, extending outward across the ridge system to the north, south, east, and west, ran a tunnel network whose total extent remains, to this day, disputed in the historical literature. American post-battle engineering surveys estimated approximately 40 miles of tunnel. Yahara's own memoir, written in Japanese in 1973 and translated into English in 1995, gives a figure of over 60 miles. That gap, 20 miles of tunnel that American surveyors apparently didn't find, is one of the quietly disturbing loose ends in the archival record. The defensive philosophy that Yahara implemented was designed around what he understood about the geometry of American infantry assaults. Every approach to every significant position on the Shuri Line was covered from multiple directions simultaneously. Take the Maeda Escarpment, the feature that would become known to American soldiers as Hacksaw Ridge, as one example. Captured Japanese artillery records, translated by American intelligence teams and now at the National Archives, reveal that every route of approach to the escarpment had been plotted to within 10 meters. Mortar and artillery crews had rehearsed the process of shifting between pre-registered target coordinates. Machine gun positions were sited not to create single fields of fire, but to create overlapping ones, so that any attacker advancing on one position was simultaneously visible to and targeted by the positions on either side. Destroying one position didn't open the approach to the next one. It just meant you were now completely visible to two surviving positions instead of three. There's a specific weapon that I want to spend a moment on, because it illustrates how precisely tailored the Japanese defensive equipment was to the specific conditions of tunnel warfare. The Type 92 battalion gun, a 70mm howitzer, had a carriage that could be disassembled into sub-components, narrow enough to move through a standard tunnel doorway. The gun could be rolled to a firing aperture cut into the limestone face of a ridge, discharged, and rolled back inside in under 1 minute. American counter-battery radar of the period, the SCR-584 system deployed with 10th Army artillery units, required a minimum of several seconds of firing signature to acquire a gun's position with sufficient precision for a return shot. A crew that could get their weapon back through a tunnel door in under 60 seconds was, in practical terms, invisible to counter-battery fire. American artillery officers during the battle reported this problem repeatedly. They were firing enormous quantities of ammunition at positions that fired back, then vanished, then fired back again from somewhere slightly different. The frustration in those after-action reports is palpable even 80 years later. When I was working through the translated excerpts of Yahara's memoir, alongside the American intelligence assessments written at the same time, one discrepancy kept catching my attention. The American assessments, particularly the G2 intelligence summaries from the early weeks of the battle, consistently described the Shuri defensive line in terms that suggest partial understanding. They identified the main ridge positions. They mapped many of the known firing points. They understood the principle of defense in depth. What they consistently underestimated was the ammunition stockpile. Pre-battle estimates placed Japanese artillery ammunition at sustainable levels for perhaps 4 to 6 weeks of intensive combat. What the 32nd Army had actually pre-positioned, according to captured Japanese quartermaster records, was approximately 11,065 tons of artillery ammunition, enough to sustain 82 days of fighting without a single resupply shipment. That figure meant the Japanese could absorb any level of American artillery superiority for the entire duration of the campaign without running short. And they did. The 11,000-ton figure deserves a moment of sustained attention, because it represents a calculation that Yahara and his logistics staff made with complete clarity of purpose. They knew that once the Americans landed, the naval blockade would prevent any resupply reaching the island by sea. They knew that air resupply was impossible against American air dominance. They were building, therefore, not a defensive system that expected to be sustained from outside, but one that was entirely self-contained. A military island within an island, designed to absorb American firepower for as long as its prepositioned stocks held. The stockpiling was the strategy. Everything that followed was just execution. Ushijima received daily reports of the American advance during the first weeks of April, watching the 10th Army push north and occupy the undefended portions of the island with impressive speed. He knew they were coming south. He knew exactly when they would encounter the outer positions of the Shuri Line. He knew what would happen when they did. His chief of staff, General Cho, a man described in multiple surviving accounts as more aggressive and less disciplined than Yahara, pushed repeatedly for early offensive action, for spoiling attacks to disrupt the American consolidation. Ushijima held back. The plan required patience. The plan required letting the Americans come to the prepared ground on the prepared terms. The plan required, in a specific and uncomfortable sense, the willingness to let his men sit underground and wait while the largest fleet in the Pacific assembled offshore above them. What Yahara understood, and what I think the post-war historiography has been slow to fully credit, is that the Shuri defense wasn't designed to defeat the American invasion. It was designed to make the American invasion so costly that the United States government would reconsider whether the next step, the invasion of the Japanese home islands, was bearable. Okinawa wasn't a last stand in the conventional sense, a desperate, doomed defense by men who had no other option. It was a calculated attrition strategy, designed with professional clarity, aimed not at the soldiers crossing the beaches, but at the planners back in Washington, who would eventually have to count the bodies and decide whether to order more men forward. Ushijima was fighting the American public's willingness to accept casualties, not the American military's ability to advance. It was a cold-blooded calculation. It was also, in the brutal arithmetic that followed, almost correct. The outer positions of the Shuri Line first made contact with American forces in the second week of April, when the 96th Infantry Division and elements of the 7th Infantry Division pushed south from their consolidated positions near the airfields. The fighting changed immediately. The open field advances of the first week, the casual movement through empty villages, the seizure of the northern part of the island, abruptly gave way to something categorically different. Japanese machine guns that had been invisible from 200 yards were suddenly firing from slits in limestone walls. Artillery, whose positions no one had identified, began hitting troop concentrations with a precision that suggested the coordinates had been logged and memorized months earlier. Men who had walked through fields on the 1st of April were now measuring their daily advance in yards instead of miles. The silence was over. The hills had names now. Hacksaw Ridge, Item Pocket, the Escarpment, Sugarloaf, Half Moon, Horseshoe. And each name became, in the weeks that followed, a kind of shorthand for a specific quality of suffering. The 32nd Army had spent 6 months building those names into the limestone, and the Americans who encountered them were going to spend the next 2 months paying for every foot of them. That was the plan. That's what the tunnel walls, the pre-registered artillery, the 70mm howitzers on their quick-roll carriages, and the 11,000 tons of ammunition were built for. The Americans had come to Okinawa with the largest fleet in the Pacific and more firepower than any previous island campaign. Ushijima and Yahara had built something designed specifically to survive it. Chapter 4. Letters Never Sent, the Human Cost Before the First Ridge. The 29th of March, 1945. Somewhere in the Philippine Sea, aboard a United States Navy transport ship, a man is writing a letter. He's a pharmacist's mate, a Navy medical rating, and he's writing to his mother. The letter is brief, the way V-mail letters tended to be, because the V-mail system photographed the letter onto microfilm and printed it smaller at the destination, which made large handwriting difficult and elaborate prose impractical. He tells her he's well. He tells her not to worry. He probably means both things. In the top right corner of the envelope, later, a rubber stamp will be applied by a postal worker at a military distribution center. The stamp reads, "Undeliverable, addressee deceased." The date on that stamp is the 12th of May, 1945. The letter was never opened. It's in the National Archives collection of undelivered personal effects from the Pacific Theater. I don't know what was in it. Neither does anyone else. The V-mail system, Victory Mail, was an American innovation that began operating in 1942 as a solution to the physical weight problem of moving personal correspondence across oceanic supply chains that were already stressed to their limits. Each letter was photographed onto a microfilm frame. The film was shipped in bulk, and the letter was printed at the destination at roughly 1/3 of its original size. A single microfilm roll could carry upward of 150,000 letters. The system reduced individual letter weight from roughly 10 grams to a fraction of a milligram for the shipping stage. It was, in its functional logic, a compression algorithm. Human emotion encoded, transmitted, and decoded at the other end, arriving smaller and slightly flattened by the process. Between April and June of 1945, the United States Army Postal Service delivered approximately 4.2 million pieces of mail to Okinawa. An estimated 37,000 pieces were returned undeliverable because the addressee had died, been wounded, or been listed as missing. 37,000 stamps applied to 37,000 envelopes by postal workers who never knew the people they were marking. Eugene Sledge, a private in Company K, 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines, 1st Marine Division, is probably the most important individual witness to the Okinawa campaign that the historical record preserves. He came from Mobile, Alabama. He had a scientific mind and a writer's eye, and he kept a notebook hidden in his field Bible throughout his time in the Pacific. Notes that his officers would have confiscated if they'd found them, because recording unit movements was a security risk. Those notes became With the Old Breed, published in 1981 by the University of Alabama Press, in an initial print run of fewer than 3,000 copies. For roughly 30 years, the most honest first-hand account of what the Pacific Island campaigns actually felt like was available to anyone who thought to look for it, and almost nobody did. Ken Burns's documentary series, The War in 2007, changed that, bringing the memoir to a national audience it should always have had. What matters here is that Sledge's letters home, his published memoir, and his unit's official records describe the same weeks from such different angles that they feel, at times, like documents from different campaigns. To me, the gap between what men wrote in their letters and what was happening to them is the most precise measurement of what war does that exists in the historical record. Sledge wrote to his parents in the days before the Okinawa landing that he was well and keeping his chin up. His memoir reveals that he was consuming phenobarbital, prescribed by a unit surgeon for anxiety during the same period. The letter was true in the way that letters home from combat zones are always true, filtered through love, through the desire not to cause additional pain to people who can't do anything useful with accurate information. The medication was also true. Both existed simultaneously. The official morale reports, compiled by Army and Marine Corps chaplains and intelligence officers during the same weeks, describe morale as high. The chaplains' own records, preserved in service archives, describe 47 separate conscience interviews conducted in the 1st Marine Division alone in the 2 weeks before the inland push. Soldiers and Marines requesting pastoral guidance on killing, on fear, on reconciling what they'd already seen with what they believed. 47 documented conversations about whether a man could do what was about to be asked of him. High morale, officially. The male situation had a texture to it that goes beyond the abstract statistic. For the men aboard the transport ships, in the days before L-Day, mail call was a specific social event, a brief window in which the outside world sent its representatives in the form of handwriting. The Marine Corps University Archives holds a photograph taken at a mail distribution point near Kadena Airfield, sometime in early April of 1945. Men are sitting and standing in a loose group, reading. Some are smiling. One man in the foreground is reading a letter with the particular focused quiet of someone who has temporarily left the island in his mind and is somewhere else entirely. The photograph was taken in the afternoon. The first mass kamikaze attack, Operation Kikusui No. 1, struck the fleet 6 hours later. There's a category of casualty from Okinawa that almost never appears in the tables that people cite when they're describing the battle's cost. The 10th Army Surgeon's final report records 26,211 non-battle casualties during the campaign. A statistical category that includes psychiatric breakdown, combat fatigue, and cases classified medically as exhaustion. This number represents approximately 14% of the entire 10th Army. And Army psychiatrists who were present during the battle documented their observations in real time, noting that the combination of near-constant artillery fire from both directions, the inability to quickly evacuate wounded due to Japanese defensive coverage of casualty collection points, and the unrelenting rain created what they described in the careful language of military medicine as a clinical profile they hadn't previously encountered. The report is precise and dispassionate. It's also, when you sit with it, a document about men being used up. 26,000 people who arrived on Okinawa intact and left it, in some fundamental way, altered. When I sat with the chaplain's record from that 1st Marine Division conscience interview series, 47 men, 2 weeks, one division, I found myself thinking less about the abstract statistics and more about the specific situation those conversations represented. A man approaches a chaplain or a unit medical officer, or in some cases simply another soldier he trusts, and tries to put into words something about what he's doing and what it's costing him. The chaplain's report is clinical in its tone, because that's what military documentation requires. But underneath the clinical language is the record of human beings trying to articulate something. The available language wasn't designed to carry. I don't have the individual words those men used. The report doesn't preserve them. What it preserves is the fact that 47 men tried, in a 2-week span, to say something true about what they were living through to someone who might listen. That's not a data point. That's a kind of courage that doesn't get counted in the casualty tables. An Okinawan school teacher named Taira Koji, whose diary was found in the ruins of Naha and translated in a post-war collection of civilian accounts, wrote in February of 1945 that Japanese army officers had arrived at his school to conscript students for labor brigades. He described the students, mostly boys between 14 and 17 years old, as appearing proud and frightened at the same time. The diary ends in April. What happened to Taira after that, the archive doesn't say. He's one of perhaps 300,000 Okinawan civilians who were on that island when the battle started, most of whom had no meaningful say in any of the decisions that had placed them there, and many of whom would not survive the next 11 weeks. The battles that get named and mapped and written about in campaign histories happen to soldiers. The space between those battles, the space where people like Taira Koji and his students exist, tends to become the silences in the official record. The weight of undelivered mail is a strange kind of historical evidence, but I keep coming back to it. 37,000 pieces of mail returned to their senders, or held in archive storage because the person they were addressed to no longer existed at a location where mail could reach them. Every piece of V-mail had been through the microfilm process, compressed, transmitted, expanded. Every piece had a stamp. Most of the stamps said something like killed in action or missing in action, or used the more bureaucratic formulation of the one I mentioned at the beginning: undeliverable, addressee deceased. The postal workers applying those stamps weren't making decisions. They were recording outcomes that had already been determined somewhere else, on some ridge in southern Okinawa, at some hour that the letter's author had not survived. The letters, compressed and printed smaller by the process of transmission, arrived at their original size at the distribution centers, and then they were stamped. And then they went back, or they went into a box, or they went eventually into an archive where someone like me can read the stamps but not the letters. The specific pharmacy inventory for Sledge's unit in the weeks before the inland advance. This is a document I came across in a peripheral search, not the kind of thing that appears in campaign histories. Shows phenobarbital listed as a dispensed pharmaceutical under his unit's medical records, not as an unusual item, as a routine one. Standard Pacific Theater protocols in 1945 included what the Army's medical regulation for that theater described as pharmacological support for anxiety presentations in pre-combat and early combat phases. The clinical language is as compressed as V-mail and about as revealing. What it means, translated out of the medical register, is that significant numbers of men going into the Okinawa campaign were being given sedative medication before they even crossed the Shuri Line. The hills were still weeks away. The fear had arrived already. Chapter 5. Kikusui, Chrysanthemums on the Water Radar Picket Station Number 1, approximately 50 miles northwest of Okinawa. The 6th of April, 1945, somewhere before dusk. A fighter director officer aboard a destroyer is watching a radar scope. The scope is of a type that performs reliably when tracking 20 separate contacts simultaneously. He has 47 contacts on his screen. The contacts are moving toward the fleet at roughly 280 knots, and they're flying low, wave-hopping in the operational terminology that had emerged from earlier kamikaze engagements, at between 30 and 50 feet above the surface of the East China Sea. At that altitude, the aircraft fall below the detection threshold of the ship's surface search radar until they're within approximately 4,000 yards. 4,000 yards at 280 knots is roughly 29 seconds. The fighter director officer picks up his handset and starts talking very quickly. The word Kikusui translates as floating chrysanthemums. It was the name the Imperial Japanese Navy gave to its organized mass kamikaze campaigns, derived from the heraldic device of a 14th century loyalist samurai. A chrysanthemum floating on water, a symbol associated in Japanese culture with both the imperial house and with a particular kind of devotion that accepts destruction as its final expression. Operation Kikusui No. 1, launched on the 6th of April, 1945, committed 355 kamikaze aircraft simultaneously against the Allied fleet supporting the Okinawa operation. It was the largest organized aerial suicide attack in history. It sank 3 destroyers and 2 ammunition ships, damaged 24 other vessels, and according to communications intercepts declassified decades later, prompted serious discussion among Admiral Spruance's staff about whether the fleet could sustain its position off Okinawa or needed to withdraw. The 10th Army, already ashore with 60,000 men, would have been stranded if that discussion had concluded differently. The radar picket line was not a defensive measure that anyone designed with enthusiasm. The concept emerged from a brutal practical problem. The fleet needed early warning of incoming kamikaze attacks, which meant placing radar-equipped ships between the fleet and the most likely approach corridors from Japanese air bases on Kyushu. The most dangerous position in that protective ring, designated Radar Picket Station Number 1, sat directly in the path of the most frequently used kamikaze attack route. The destroyers assigned to picket duty understood what that meant. A destroyer's crew complement was typically around 300 officers and enlisted men. The ships at Station Number 1 were, in a functional, if not officially acknowledged sense, being used as expendable early warning systems. Out of 101 destroyers, destroyer minesweepers, and related vessels assigned to picket station duty during the campaign, 10 were sunk and 32 were damaged. The men aboard them knew their assignment from the first day. The kamikaze tactic had been under continuous development since it was first employed systematically in the Philippine Sea Campaign of late 1944. And by the time of Okinawa, it had been technically refined in ways that the popular image of fanatical improvisation doesn't capture. The wave-hopping approach that saturated the fighter director officer's screen was specifically designed to exploit a known gap in American radar coverage. The SC and SK radar sets deployed on most American surface combatants of the period had a sea-return clutter zone at low altitudes. Essentially, the radar couldn't distinguish between wave surfaces and low-flying aircraft below a certain elevation. Japanese naval aviation planners had studied American radar capabilities carefully and concluded that an attack profile at 30 to 50 feet above the ocean surface would give a defending ship approximately 14 seconds of usable warning from the moment of detection to the moment of impact. 14 seconds was not enough time for a Bofors 40mm anti-aircraft cannon crew to acquire, track, and effectively engage a target closing at nearly 300 knots. The tactic wasn't suicidal madness. It was a studied technical exploitation of a documented sensor gap. I want to sit with the USS Laffey for a moment, because her experience on the 16th of April, 1945, at Radar Picket Station Number 1 is one of the most documented single ship actions of the campaign, and it illustrates something about the picket line that pure statistics can't convey. The Laffey was an Allen M. Sumner-class destroyer, 401 feet long, armed with 6 5-inch guns and multiple anti-aircraft batteries. In roughly 80 minutes on that April afternoon, she was attacked by approximately 22 kamikaze aircraft and conventional dive bombers. She was hit by 6 kamikazes and 4 bombs. She lost 32 men killed and 71 wounded. She didn't sink. Her crew, working damage control in conditions that the ship's action report describes without embellishment, kept her afloat when the technical calculation of damage to a ship of her class suggested she shouldn't have been. The men who were fighting fires in her forward sections, while additional aircraft were still attacking from above, weren't following a protocol. They were past protocols. They were operating entirely on the logic that the ship must not go down. The official United States Navy history of the Okinawa campaign credits the Combat Air Patrol, the Hellcats and Corsairs flying protective cover over the fleet, with destroying approximately 60% of all attacking kamikaze aircraft. That figure has been accepted without significant challenge in most popular accounts. But when I was working through the Japanese aviation records that were translated post-war and are now at the National Archives, a different arithmetic emerged. Of the roughly 1,900 aircraft, the Japanese Navy and Army deployed in kamikaze operations during the full Okinawa campaign, approximately 1,321 failed to return from their sorties. But some of those non-returns were mechanical failures, navigation errors, and weather aborts, not interceptions. The actual American intercept rate, working from both sides of the ledger simultaneously, is probably closer to 50%, with significant uncertainty on both ends. The official figure of 60% is plausible but optimistic. This is the kind of discrepancy that only becomes visible when you hold the two archives against each other, rather than reading each one in isolation. When I was cross-referencing the fighter director accounts with the Japanese kamikaze force records, I found something that I think deserves more attention than it typically receives in the general histories. Vice Admiral Matome Ugaki, who commanded the Special Attack Forces during the Okinawa campaign and kept a detailed diary throughout the war, published after his death as Fading Victory, was not a man who believed in the tactic unreservedly. His diary entries from the Okinawa period show a commander who understood the attrition his forces were absorbing, who calculated the exchange ratios, and who continued because the institutional logic of the Imperial Navy in 1945 had reached a point where continuing was the only form of action available to a man in his position. He records the number of aircraft that didn't return. He records the names of specific pilots who had visited his quarters before their final sorties. He wrote all of it down. And then, on the 15th of August, 1945, the day Japan formally surrendered, he climbed into an aircraft at Oita Airfield and flew a final kamikaze mission, dying as the war that had produced him ended. His diary was recovered. He was gone. The Navy's total casualties at Okinawa, 4,907 sailors killed and 4,824 wounded, represent the bloodiest single campaign in United States naval history, surpassing even the losses at Pearl Harbor in December of 1941. This figure almost never appears in the summary tables cited in ground battle accounts of Okinawa, which focus on the Army and Marine Corps casualties ashore. The two campaigns, the naval war fought on steel decks in the East China Sea, and the land war fought in limestone tunnels in southern Okinawa, are typically described in separate chapters of separate books, which creates the impression that they were separate events. They weren't. They were simultaneous dimensions of the same battle. The 10th Army needed the fleet to stay. The fleet was being systematically targeted by a force whose specific operational objective was to make staying too costly. The sailors who died on the picket line were dying to keep the soldiers ashore from being stranded. The soldiers ashore never saw those deaths. They happened somewhere over the horizon, in the dark, to people they'd never met. There's a detail from the action report filed by USS LCS L-357, a smaller landing craft support vessel assigned to picket duty during the April 12th attacks, that has stayed with me since I first read it. The report describes a wave of 4 aircraft approaching from the east. At, the writer estimates, approximately 0 feet altitude. The writing is standard naval format, calm, sequential, precise in its measurements. But the third carbon copy of the report, the administrative file copy, has a brownish smear across its upper right corner, that no archival cleaning process has been able to entirely remove. The smear could be many things. It could be coffee from the administrative office. It could be something else. I don't know, and neither does anyone who has catalogued the document. But every time I return to that report, I find myself looking at that corner first. Some evidence doesn't require verification. Some evidence just sits there, brown and quiet, and says what it says. The 10 Kikusui operations ran between the 6th of April and the 22nd of June, 1945, the full span of the land battle. They involved approximately 1,465 dedicated kamikaze sorties, plus an additional 1,391 conventional attack sorties. They sank 36 Allied ships and damaged 368 more. No aircraft carrier or battleship was sunk. Ushijima's calculation, when he designed the Shuri defense in combination with the naval attrition strategy, was that the fleet might crack before the army did, that the cumulative damage to the naval support structure would force a withdrawal that would strand the 10th Army and make the ground battle unwinnable. It came closer to working than the official histories acknowledge. In the spring of 1945, the men on the picket destroyers were holding a line as surely as the men in the limestone ridges were trying to break one. Both lines held, at great cost, but they held. Chapter 6. Hacksaw Ridge. One man, no weapon, 75 lives near Urazo-Mura, Okinawa. Late April, 1945. A 400-foot limestone escarpment rises from the valley floor like a broken wall, its face nearly vertical, the top hidden from below by an overhang that makes the climbing harder. The escarpment has a formal designation, the Maeda Escarpment, but the men of the 1st Battalion, 307th Infantry Regiment, 77th Infantry Division have other names for it. None of them printable, all of them accurate. To reach the top, they climb cargo nets strung over the cliff face. From the lip above, Japanese defenders can look straight down at the men on the nets. The Americans at the base of the escarpment know this. They climb anyway, because the orders say to climb, because the Shuri Line's outer defenses run through this ground, because there is no other way forward that the plan allows for. Somewhere in the second wave of men on those nets, carrying no weapon but a first aid kit and a rope, is a 25-year-old Seventh-day Adventist from Lynchburg, Virginia, named Desmond Thomas Doss. He is a medic. He has never carried a rifle. He never will. The official Medal of Honor citation for Private First Class Desmond T. Doss, signed by President Harry S. Truman on the 12th of October, 1945, is 7 paragraphs long. It is a document written in the careful formal register of military commendation, which means it is simultaneously precise and, in a certain way, insufficient. The citation states that Doss was a company aid man when the 1st Battalion assaulted a jagged escarpment 400 feet high. It states that, as our troops gained the summit, a heavy concentration of artillery, mortar, and machine gun fire crashed into them, inflicting approximately 75 casualties and driving the others back. It states that Doss refused to seek cover and instead began carrying the men to the edge of the escarpment and lowering them to friendly hands below. He fashioned a rope litter, the citation says, and lowered the casualties one by one over the edge. 7 paragraphs. The phrase one by one appears in paragraph 4 and does not expand because the formal citation register doesn't expand. The actual meaning of one by one over several hours, alone, under fire, on a plateau from which everyone else had retreated, is something the citation's format cannot contain. The Maeda Escarpment sat within the outer defensive belt of the Shuri Line. and it was held by Japanese forces who had prepared their positions with the same methodical precision that characterized the rest of the 32nd Army's defensive network. The plateau at the top was crisscrossed with fire from adjacent positions on neighboring ridges that could see the plateau surface and had it registered for artillery and mortar fire. An American assault force reaching the top of the escarpment didn't arrive in safety. It arrived on an open surface under observation from 3 directions simultaneously. The 1st Battalion's initial assault, which reached the crest, held it briefly and was then driven back by a concentrated Japanese response, was not an unusual result for the conditions. It was, by the mathematics of the Shuri Line, exactly what Yahara's defensive architecture was designed to produce. The Americans weren't being defeated by the Japanese soldiers on top of the escarpment. They were being defeated by Japanese soldiers in positions they couldn't see, on ridges they hadn't taken yet, firing at coordinates that had been plotted months earlier. The 77th Infantry Division had expended approximately 8,300 artillery rounds against the Maida escarpment and its surrounding positions in the 4 days preceding the assault. That works out to roughly 1 round every 42 seconds around the clock for 4 days. The tunnel system beneath the escarpment's Japanese defensive positions absorbed that expenditure without structural collapse. Artillery at this level of the Shuri Line wasn't ineffective. It suppressed movement, it disrupted communications. It imposed a physical and psychological cost on the defenders. But it didn't destroy what was underground, and what was underground was everything that mattered. When the 1st Battalion's men reached the top of the escarpment, they were meeting defenders who had survived 4 days of continuous bombardment by going deep enough into the limestone that the shells couldn't follow them. The mathematics of the assault were never going to favor the attackers. The men went up the cargo nets anyway. On the 2nd of May, the 1st Battalion gained the plateau summit and was immediately hit by a Japanese counter-response of such intensity that the surviving soldiers began withdrawing back to the cliff edge within a matter of hours. Approximately 75 men were left wounded on the plateau. The retreat carried most of the unwounded soldiers back over the cargo nets and down the cliff face. DOS stayed. What followed, over several hours, in conditions that the after-action accounts describe as near-continuous enemy activity, was a process of searching the smoke-hazed plateau, locating wounded men one by one, fashioning a rope loop that allowed him, alone, to lower an unconscious or incapacitated man over the cliff edge to men waiting below, and then returning to find the next one. Between each recovery, by his own account recorded for army historians in the months following the battle, he prayed the same prayer. "Lord, help me get one more." He repeated it until there were no more men left to carry to the edge. His commanding officer, Captain Vernon Getz, stated in a sworn affidavit that DOS had saved at least 50 men, possibly more. The Medal of Honor citation uses the figure of approximately 75. The discrepancy, 25 people, isn't the result of dishonesty on either side. It's the result of trying to count specific acts performed by one person under fire, on a plateau covered in smoke and bodies, over the course of several hours, without a recorder present. Nobody was counting. Getz was estimating from what he could observe from below. The citation committee was reconstructing from interviews conducted weeks later with men who were themselves wounded and medicated during the events they were describing. The minimum credible estimate is still staggering. The maximum estimate is almost beyond the capacity of the imagination to process if you sit with it long enough. 75 individual decisions to return to the edge of that plateau and lower one more man down. I find myself returning to one specific detail about Doss's service record that carries more weight, I think, than any single episode of heroism. Before Okinawa, Doss's commanding officers had made multiple formal requests to have him transferred out of their unit or discharged from the army entirely. The reasoning was stated clearly. A soldier who refused on religious grounds to carry a weapon was a tactical liability and a morale problem. The requests are in his service record, stamped and filed. The same chain of command that tried to remove him later filed the Medal of Honor nomination. Both sets of documents are real. Both sets are in his personnel file at the National Personnel Records Center. The first set describes a man who was considered unsuitable for combat service. The second set describes the first conscientious objector in American history to be awarded the Medal of Honor. The gap between those two characterizations is not just a story about one individual. It's a story about the limits of institutional prediction. When I was reading through the Maeda Escarpment engagement reports alongside Doss's citation and the various sworn statements submitted in support of the nomination, I kept finding one particular quality in how the witnesses described him. Men who had been on that plateau, men who were wounded and had been lowered over the cliff, described him in terms that weren't primarily about bravery, though bravery was clearly present. They described a kind of stillness, not calm exactly, but purposefulness, the quality of a person who has reduced the available decisions to one and is executing it without the interference of alternatives. Doss himself, in his Army historian interview, describes the experience in straightforward terms. He didn't think about whether to stay. He was a medic. The men needed a medic. He stayed. The simplicity of that accounting, given what staying cost him physically. He was eventually evacuated in late May with a fractured left arm and 17 pieces of shrapnel in his body, is something the formal language of commendation can gesture toward but never quite reach. The Maeda Escarpment as a military objective didn't stay taken on the 2nd of May. The positions changed hands repeatedly over the following days, as both sides committed additional forces to the ridgeline. American artillery units fired another estimated several thousand rounds at the plateau and surrounding positions before the escarpment was finally secured enough to hold. Men went up and came back down and went up again. The 37th Infantry Division's history of the Maeda engagement reads, in places like a ledger, the units committed, the casualties sustained per assault. The coordinates of the positions taken and then lost and taken again. The ledger is accurate, and the ledger is necessary, and the ledger is not, by itself, what happened there. What happened there included Desmond Doss on a plateau at night, lowering unconscious men over a cliff edge and going back for more, spraying one sentence in between. The ledger records the outcome. The outcome was built, in part, by the quality of one man's decision not to leave. On the 21st of May, 1945, while Doss was assisting in the evacuation of a wounded soldier, a grenade exploded close enough to him to fracture his left arm and drive 17 fragments of shrapnel into various parts of his body. He waited 5 hours on the ground before a litter team could reach him, reportedly waving the team away multiple times, so that men he judged more critically wounded could be evacuated first. When the litter team finally reached him and began carrying him back, a Japanese sniper's bullet struck his arm, adding a fresh fracture to the existing one. He used his rifle scabbard as a splint, improvised a dressing, and crawled 300 yards to the nearest aid station rather than call the litter team back. The reason he gave, in his testimony, was that he didn't want to pull the team away from more serious casualties. That's in the record. That's documented. I don't have a framework that fully accounts for it. I'm not sure one exists. Chapter 7. The Widowmaker, Loaf Hill, and the Marine Corps' Worst Week, the 14th of May, 1945. Southern Okinawa. A hill rises 50 feet from the valley floor. 50 feet. You could walk its length in under a minute on level ground. From the air, it probably didn't register as anything meaningful. A small bump on a limestone plateau, scarred by weeks of artillery fire, surrounded by two slightly lower companion features that the maps called Horseshoe and Half Moon. The men who were about to be sent against it had names for all three hills, none of them polite. The official designation was Sugarloaf. The 6th Marine Division's 22nd Marines began their first assault at 8:30 on the morning of the 14th, and by 10 o'clock, something like 60% of the lead company's strength was gone. The hill had not been taken. They would try again the next day, and the day after that, and every day for the next 5 days, at intervals that the casualty reports make look almost routine. The way lists look routine, even when what they're recording is not. The geometry of the Sugarloaf complex was the key to understanding why it was so extraordinarily costly to assault. And I want to be precise about it because the popular shorthand, a heavily defended hill, doesn't capture the actual tactical problem. Sugarloaf, Horseshoe Hill, and Half Moon Hill formed a rough triangle. Each position had overlapping fields of fire covering the approach routes to the other two. If you attack Sugarloaf from the north, the most natural approach, you were simultaneously under observed fire from Horseshoe to your left and Half Moon to your right. If you attacked Horseshoe, Sugarloaf's defenders could see your entire assault from above and behind. The complex was, in the clinical language of military engineering, a mutually supporting defensive system. In practice, it meant that neutralizing any one position required simultaneously suppressing the other two, and the Marines had neither the flanking room nor the available infantry to do that simultaneously. Yahara had placed those three hills with the same deliberate geometry that characterized every position on the Shuri Line. The Marines weren't walking into a defense, they were walking into a calculation. The 22nd Marines' assault on the 14th of May opened with what the regimental record describes as artillery preparation. Companies G and F attacked in sequence. Company G reached the crest of Sugarloaf in the initial assault and held it for a period measured in minutes, less than an hour by most accounts, before the fire from the flanking hills made the position untenable. When the survivors retreated off the crest, they had left behind roughly 70% of the men who had gone up. Company G had begun the morning with approximately 225 men. By mid-afternoon, 75 were able to remain at their posts without assistance. The regimental history records this with the matter-of-fact precision of a military document, which is to say, it records the numbers without flinching and without fully communicating what those numbers mean when applied to the faces of a company that had been a community that morning and was no longer that by evening. The 5th day of the Sugarloaf fighting, the 18th of May, is when the Marines finally secured the position well enough to hold it. By then, the 6th Marine Division had committed the better part of 3 infantry regiments to the assault. The 22nd Marines, the 29th Marines, and elements of the 4th Marines had all fed units into the complex at various points. The final tally of Marine casualties for the Sugarloaf complex as a whole was 2,662 killed and wounded, with an additional 1,289 men evacuated for combat fatigue. More than 1,600 of those casualties fell in the 5-day period between the 14th and 18th of May. 62% of the 6th Division's total campaign losses concentrated into 5 days of fighting on 3 hills with a combined area of less than 15 acres. The statistics are accurate. They're also, by themselves, inadequate. They don't tell you what it felt like to be a company commander on the 4th morning, just looking at what was left of your unit roster and writing the next day's assault orders anyway. I've spent time with the 6th Marine Division Special Action Report for the Sugarloaf period, which is held at the Marine Corps University Archives at Quantico. It's a document of the kind that military bureaucracies produce under pressure, precise in its unit designations and geographic references, economical in its description of human experience. What strikes me most about it isn't the tactical narrative. It's the maintenance section at the back, where the regimental equipment officers tallied the weapons lost during the 5-day assault. Rifles, machine guns, radio sets, mortars. Each item has a serial number and a loss category. Combat loss, abandoned under fire, unrecoverable. The serial numbers are there because military property accountability requires them. But they also mean that each piece of equipment was carried up that hill by a specific person, and the equipment that's marked unrecoverable is the equipment that's still up there because the person who carried it didn't come back for it. Now, there's a specific tactical problem with the tank support at Sugarloaf that I think matters for understanding why the hill cost so much to take. The M4A3 Sherman tanks that were supposed to provide suppressing fire for the Marine infantry had to navigate a reverse slope approach to the eastern face of Sugarloaf that Japanese engineers had mined with wooden anti-tank devices, the Type 99 mine, a wooden box design whose casing was invisible to the SCR-625 mine detector carried by American combat engineers. Metal detectors find metal. The Type 99 was built out of wood with only a minimal metal pressure plate, specifically to defeat the equipment the Americans were using. Several Shermans were lost or immobilized on that approach. When the tanks couldn't get through, the infantry had to go without them. And going up Sugarloaf without tank suppression meant going up with only the organic firepower of a rifle platoon against positions that had survived weeks of naval bombardment. That wooden mine casing wasn't an improvisation. It was the product of engineers who had studied American equipment closely enough to build a weapon specifically shaped to defeat it. When the 29th Marines finally cleared the last organized resistance from the Sugarloaf complex on the 18th of May, one of the first patrols to move across the position reported what the patrol leader described in his debrief as a landscape so altered from the original terrain that the topographic features on his map no longer corresponded to what he was looking at. 2 weeks of American artillery preparation, followed by 5 days of close combat, had changed the shape of the ground. The 50-foot hill was still 50 feet high, more or less, but the surface bore no resemblance to the pastoral feature it had been in April. It was craters and broken limestone, and the physical residue of a week of industrial-scale violence in a very small space. The patrol moved through it and kept going south, because south was where the Shuri Line continued, and the line didn't care what the men taking it had just come from. Sugarloaf Hill exists today as a small rise in the suburbs of Naha City. A convenience store occupies part of the ground. A residential apartment block stands on the slope where the 22nd Marines lost 70% of a company in a single morning. A small memorial plaque was placed there in the 1990s, and it's easy to miss if you don't know to look for it. I find myself thinking about the people who live in those apartments, going about their days above ground that was consecrated in the most brutal possible way by the deaths of several hundred young men who had come from places like Georgia and Ohio and California to fight over a limestone rise in a subtropical island chain they probably couldn't have found on a map 2 years earlier. The hill doesn't know any of this. The hill is just there, modest and 50 feet high, the same height it always was. The broader tactical context of the Sugarloaf fighting is essential to understanding what it represented within the Shuri Line as a whole. While the 6th Marine Division was grinding through the complex on the western end of the American line, the 96th Infantry Division and the 1st Marine Division were engaged in equally costly fighting at Wanna Ridge and Wanna Draw on the central and eastern portions of the same defensive belt. The Shuri Line wasn't a single position being attacked from one direction. It was a continuous fortified system being attacked across its full width simultaneously, and the Americans were bleeding everywhere along it at roughly the same rate. The 22nd Marines casualty report for May 14th through 18th is one document among dozens of similar documents generated by different units during the same period, all recording the same essential story in different geographical coordinates. The Shuri Line didn't have a weak point. Yahara had designed it without one. On the 18th of May, 1945, when the last Sugarloaf positions were cleared and the Marines consolidated on the ground they'd paid for, the Shuri Line was still intact across most of its length. Taking Sugarloaf hadn't broken anything. It had moved the American line forward by approximately 500 yards on the western flank. 500 yards in 5 days. 1,289 cases of combat fatigue. 2,662 killed and wounded. The arithmetic of those figures against that distance is the arithmetic of the Shuri Line. Yahara's calculation made legible in yards and bodies. The Marines had won. They had taken the ground. The ground cost what the ground cost, and there was more ground ahead, and the line was still there, and there was nothing to do but continue south. Chapter 8. The Argument on the Ridge. Buckner versus the Marines. Somewhere in the second week of May, 1945, while the 22nd Marines were feeding companies into Sugarloaf and receiving them back at 50% strength, two distinct arguments were being conducted simultaneously about how this battle should be fought. One argument was happening in the forward headquarters of the 10th Army, in a series of operational briefings between Lieutenant General Simon Buckner and his corps commanders. The other argument was happening in the less formal settings of Marine general officers who had been watching the Shuri Line consume their divisions for 3 weeks, and were beginning to believe that the man in command of the battle was fighting it the wrong way. These weren't arguments about whether the Shuri Line would eventually fall. Everyone agreed it would. These were arguments about how many men it needed to cost before it did, and whether a different approach existed that could reduce that number. The official record of these arguments is incomplete and partially sanitized. What survives in the documents is enough. The core of the alternative argument was an amphibious envelopment, a secondary landing on Okinawa's southeastern coast, behind the Shuri Line, that would force Ushijima to divide his forces and potentially collapse the entire defensive system from the rear. The 6th Division's Major General Lemuel Shepard, along with Marine General Roy Geiger commanding the 3rd Amphibious Corps, raised this option formally. The 2nd Marine Division was sitting offshore in reserve, afloat and essentially unused. The southeastern beaches were available. The concept was, in principle, the same kind of amphibious end run that had worked for the Allies in other Pacific campaigns, and it was squarely within the Marine Corps institutional tradition of finding open flanks rather than forcing closed ones. Buckner rejected it. His stated reasons centered on logistics, specifically His assessment that the southeastern beaches couldn't support the supply requirements of a fresh division in the volumes that sustained combat operations demanded, and on the risk of landing troops against an alerted enemy who had positioned artillery to cover those beaches. Now, the historical argument about whether Buckner was right is one of the genuine unresolved debates of the Okinawa campaign, and I want to be honest about my own position when I look at it. The Army's official history, Okinawa, The Last Battle, published in 1948, defends Buckner's decision on logistical grounds and calls the alternative not supportable given available resources. The Marine Corps' official account, The Final Campaign, published in 1994, takes a more skeptical view, arguing that the logistical objection was overstated and that the real constraint was institutional preference rather than practical limitation. When I sat with the 10th Army logistical assessment documents from May 1945 and worked through the beach capacity estimates for the southeastern coast, the calculation wasn't as clear-cut as the Army history suggested. The 2nd Marine Division required approximately 600 tons of supply per day to sustain operations. The Navy's assessment of southeastern beach capacity under May conditions was approximately 2,000 tons per day. The arithmetic supported a landing. Whether the artillery risk made it untenable is a qualitative judgment that the surviving documents don't resolve. General Douglas MacArthur, commanding Army forces in the Philippines and technically uninvolved in the Okinawa command structure, sent communications to Admiral Nimitz in May, expressing critical views of Buckner's frontal assault approach. MacArthur's habit of criticizing other commanders' operations from a safe geographic distance was sufficiently well established by 1945 that his opinion on this matter was noted, filed, and largely dismissed by the Nimitz headquarters. But the fact that MacArthur was saying it combined with the formal objections being raised by Marine generals who were watching their divisions bleed for inches, suggests that Buckner's approach wasn't universally considered optimal, even by the people who were professionally obligated to support it. To me, what's most striking about the command friction at Okinawa isn't that it existed. Friction between Army and Marine Corps doctrine was a constant throughout the Pacific War, but that it was operating in the context of the Shuri Line at genuinely enormous human cost per day. Every day that the argument continued without resolution was a day of approximately 150 American dead at the campaign's average rate. The argument wasn't abstract. The technical case against the frontal assault is most visible in the artillery consumption figures. At the height of the Shuri Line fighting, the 10th Army was expending approximately 60,000 artillery rounds per day against the defensive system. 60,000 rounds per day. That number, drawn from the 10th Army's own ammunition supply records, is large enough to require a moment of consideration. It represents roughly 42 shells per minute, sustained around the clock across a frontage of approximately 5 miles. And against those 60,000 rounds per day, the 10th Army was advancing an average of 200 to 400 yards per day. Working through that ratio, shells to yards, is an exercise in understanding what the Shuri tunnel system actually meant in physical terms. The Japanese ammunition stockpile was responding to American expenditure by continuing to fire back from positions the American bombardment couldn't reach. The exchange was extraordinarily expensive for both sides and was producing slow American progress and steady Japanese attrition. But it was producing both at rates that the American industrial supply chain could sustain, and the Japanese pre-positioned stockpile eventually could not. Buckner's personal diary, a document that's available in partial transcription through academic publications focused on the Okinawa command history, shows a man who was entirely aware of the criticism being directed at him, who addressed it as a tactical matter rather than a personal one, and who maintained his approach based on his assessment of what the logistical and terrain constraints actually permitted. Whether his assessment was correct is a question that can't be answered from the archival record, because it's fundamentally a counterfactual question. A southern landing might have cost fewer men than the frontal assault. It might have cost more. Nobody ran the experiment. What the documents do show is that the men who were dying in the frontal assault were dying in a battle whose alternative had been proposed, debated, and rejected, and that the people who rejected it had reasons, and the people who proposed it also had reasons, and the men in the rifle companies didn't get a vote. The question of General Geiger's conduct after Buckner's death is one of those quiet historical details that tends to get underplayed in the campaign histories. When Buckner was killed on the 18th of June, 1945, 3 days before the battle officially ended, struck by Japanese artillery fragments while observing a Marine assault from a forward position, command of the 10th Army passed to Geiger, making him the first Marine officer in American history to command a field army in combat. He held that command for 4 days. The battle was functionally over by the time he assumed command, the Japanese organized resistance having collapsed in the Mabuni Hills. In those 4 days, Geiger issued no public criticism of Buckner's methods. He conducted the final operations with quiet efficiency. And when General Stilwell arrived to take permanent command, Geiger stepped aside without comment. Whatever he thought about the previous 8 weeks of frontal assault, the record he chose to leave behind doesn't say it directly. In the archive, silence is also a kind of evidence. There's a passage in a post-war analysis of the Okinawa campaign, produced for Army Command and General Staff College, that describes the Buckner-Geiger controversy with the careful diplomatic language of an institution evaluating one of its own decisions. It acknowledges the debate. It notes the differing service perspectives. It concludes, in the measured language of institutional history, that Buckner's approach was consistent with accepted doctrine and the constraints of the operational environment. That conclusion may be accurate. It's also entirely unsatisfying, and I think it's meant to be. Institutional histories that close debates rather than sustaining them are protecting something beyond the historical record. And in this case, what they're protecting is the reputation of a man who died before he could defend himself, against a critique that was made by people who were themselves operating under enormous institutional and personal pressure. Everyone involved in that argument, the men who proposed the envelopment, the man who rejected it, the men who died during the weeks the argument was resolved by continuation, deserves a fuller accounting than the institutional record provides. When Buckner was killed at his forward observation post on the 18th of June, he had been watching the 8th Marines assault a position on the Mabuni Peninsula. The Japanese artillery round that killed him, the 5th in a salvo by the accounts of the men who were with him, struck a coral rock that sent fragments in multiple directions. He lost consciousness within minutes and was dead shortly after. He was 58 years old. He was the son of a Confederate general, a West Point graduate, a man who had commanded the Alaska defenses in the early years of the Pacific War. He'd been given the largest ground command ever assigned to an American officer in the Pacific Theater. He brought the Shuri Line down. Whether he could have done it faster, at lower cost, by a different method, he died without knowing. So did everyone else. The battle essentially died with him. By the 18th of June, the organized Japanese resistance on the Mabuni Hills was disintegrating, with units dissolving into small groups moving through the caves and gullies of the island's southern tip. Ushijima was underground at Hill 89, 4 days from his own death. The argument about how the battle should have been fought would outlast both of them by decades, continuing through service histories, staff college papers, and the occasional heated academic conference, with no resolution that entirely satisfies either side. That unresolved argument is, in its own way, the most honest legacy of the Shuri Line. A reminder that the decisions that cost the most are never simple, and that the men who make them are rarely given enough information, enough time, or enough certainty to make them cleanly. Chapter 9: Typhoon of Steel. The Okinawan Civilian Catastrophe. The archive of Okinawan civilian testimony, collected by the Okinawa Prefectural Board of Education between 1971 and 1974, runs to many hundreds of pages of translated oral history, the recorded memories of people who were children or young adults in 1945, who witnessed the battle from inside it, not as soldiers or sailors, but as the people who lived on the island where the battle happened to take place. These documents are almost never cited in English-language campaign histories, which tend to be organized around military units and command decisions and tactical objectives. The civilian testimonies aren't organized around any of those things. They're organized around hiding places, around the particular cave or basement or drainage ditch that a given family found in a given week, and how long they were able to stay there before something forced them to move. Reading them after several days of working through the military records is a disorienting experience, because the battle looks entirely different from inside a cave than it does from a command post, and both perspectives are completely real. The statistical range for Okinawan civilian deaths during the campaign runs from 40,000 to 150,000, depending on the methodology and the sources used. That range, a gap of 110,000 human lives, isn't a scholarly nuance or a rounding difference. It's a direct reflection of the fact that neither the American military nor the Japanese military maintained systematic records of civilian casualties during the battle. The Japanese 32nd Army destroyed significant portions of its own Okinawan conscript records in June of 1945. American tactical reports recorded enemy dead and occasionally noted civilian casualties in specific incidents, but there was no systematic accounting at the theater level. The most honest summary of the Okinawan civilian death toll is this: we don't know, and the uncertainty is large enough that it should be uncomfortable for anyone who cares about what actually happened here. To me, the absence of a reliable number is itself a form of evidence of what was considered important enough to count and what wasn't. The Himayuri Student Corps was one of several student labor and medical units mobilized from Okinawan schools in the final months of the war. 2 girls' high schools in Naha, the Okinawa First Girls High School and the Daiichi Girls High School, provided 222 students and 18 teachers who were assigned to underground field hospitals in the Japanese 32nd Army's medical complex. The average age of the students was around 17. They had been given roughly 3 weeks of basic medical training before being sent underground into a tunnel system that was simultaneously a military headquarters, an ammunition depot, and a hospital. They worked in conditions that the medical records describe in clinical terms as extremely difficult. Poor ventilation, inadequate lighting, limited supplies, and a constant stream of casualties from the fighting above. What the medical records can't fully convey is what it meant to be 17 years old in a limestone tunnel beneath a battle you didn't start, caring for men dying of wounds you didn't have the training or equipment to treat. When the Japanese 32nd Army began its withdrawal from Shuri in late May of 1945, the Himayuri students received what their surviving accounts describe as a formal discharge order. They were told they were released from military duty. The order was issued without provisions. No food distribution, no escort, no instructions about where to go or how to survive in a battle zone that was being compressed into an ever smaller area as American forces pushed south. The students who received that order were in tunnel complexes in the battle area. Outside those tunnels was the last phase of the Shuri fighting. Of the 240 members of the Himayuri Corps, 136 were killed, 57% of the total, most of them in the weeks following that discharge order, in circumstances that ranged from direct combat deaths to starvation, disease, and the kind of deaths that happen when young people with no weapons and no supplies are released into a battle zone and told they are free to go. The question of how Okinawan civilians died is more complicated than most campaign histories acknowledge, and it's a complication that runs in more than one direction. Japanese soldiers distributed grenades to civilians in caves in the final weeks of the battle, and by the consistent account of surviving Okinawan testimony collected across multiple decades, threatened civilians who attempted to surrender with death. The Japanese military's post-war accounts describe what followed as voluntary patriotic sacrifice. Okinawan's survivor testimony describes it differently, as coercion, explicit and sometimes violent, by Japanese soldiers who had been told that capture was worse than death, and who communicated that belief to civilians in the most direct terms available. These two characterizations of the same events are not reconcilable. The evidence from direct witness testimony, collected from survivors over the following decades, is more specific and more numerous than the institutional Japanese account. I find myself unable to give them equal weight. At the same time, American forces were using napalm-based incendiary attacks to clear cave positions throughout the campaign. The M1A1 flamethrower, with its roughly 4-gallon fuel capacity and 46-meter range, was one of the standard tools for reducing positions that artillery couldn't reach. It was devastatingly effective at its technical purpose. It was also applied to caves that contained civilians sheltering alongside Japanese soldiers, because there was frequently no way to know from outside a cave which kind of occupants it held. American tactical records acknowledge individual incidents of this nature, but don't reflect a systematic accounting of civilian deaths caused by American fire. The moral and historical accounting for those deaths, like so much of the Okinawan civilian experience, exists in a register that neither side's official record adequately addresses. When I was working through the translated Okinawan testimony, alongside the American medical section reports from the same period, I found a recurring pattern that the military documents couldn't have captured. The medical reports describe civilian casualty incidents in the language of tactical consequence. Locations, unit involved, approximate numbers, category of weapon. The Okinawan testimonies describe the same events as sequences of particular people making impossible choices in real time. In one testimony, a woman describes a family decision made in a cave in the Mabuni area in late June. The description is indirect, and the details are specific in the way that memories of terrible things tend to be specific. The military report for that area on that date records the clearing of a defensive cave complex with moderate resistance. The two documents are describing the same event. The distance between them is the distance between what war looks like from command and what it looks like from inside a family. In 2007, the Japanese national government proposed revisions to Okinawan high school history textbooks that would have removed the passages describing Japanese soldiers ordering civilians to commit suicide. The protests that followed were the largest in Okinawan history since the island's reversion to Japanese sovereignty in 1972. An estimated 110,000 people gathering in a single demonstration. The government ultimately reversed the proposed revision and reinstated the original passages. What's significant about that episode, from a historical perspective, isn't that it happened. Contested memory of difficult events produces exactly these kinds of political pressures in every country that has them, but that it happened 62 years after the battle, and that the Okinawan population was still numerous enough and engaged enough with the specific events of 1945 to turn out in those numbers to contest a textbook revision. The memory of the civilian experience of Okinawa was still alive enough 6 decades later to bring 110,000 people into the streets over a paragraph. That's not a footnote. That's evidence. The 100,000 or so Okinawan civilians who survived the battle by hiding in caves, drainage channels, and collapsed buildings emerged in June and July of 1945 into an island that was almost unrecognizable as the place they'd lived before. The southern portion of the island, the area where most of the civilian population had been concentrated, and where the entire battle's final phase had played out, was essentially rubble. Naha, the capital, was largely destroyed. The agricultural land had been chewed up by tracked vehicles, cratered by artillery, and saturated with the residue of 2 armies' worth of equipment and ammunition. The infrastructure, roads, water systems, markets, schools, was gone. The people who came out of the caves came out into an American military occupation that would last, in one form or another, until 1972. 27 years. Children who had hidden in caves in June of 1945 became adults, and middle-aged people in a territory administered by the government of the country, whose forces had helped destroy what they'd been hiding from. The word that Japanese propagandists used to describe the Okinawa campaign to civilians before and during the battle was Tetsu no Ame, typhoon of steel. It was meant to be a warning about American firepower, a preparation for what was coming. The people who lived through it used the phrase differently afterward. It became, in the oral histories and the memorial language of post-war Okinawa, a name for the experience of being in it, rather than a description of what caused it. The typhoon didn't distinguish between soldiers and civilians. It didn't ask what language you spoke, or whether you had a weapon, or how old you were. It was simply a state of total environmental violence that lasted 82 days and then stopped, leaving the people still alive inside it to find out what was left. Chapter 10. The Yamato Sails to Die Operation. 10 Go. The 6th of April, 1945. Tokuyama Fuel Depot, Hiroshima Prefecture. A fuel loading operation is underway for the world's largest battleship and 9 accompanying vessels. The ship is IJN Yamato. She displaces 72,800 tons fully loaded, a figure large enough that comprehending it requires a comparison. She is heavier than every Allied warship currently anchored off Okinawa combined, with some left over. Her 9 18.1-inch main guns fire shells, weighing 3,219 pounds apiece, each one roughly the weight of a compact car, to a maximum range of approximately 26 miles. She was built to be unkillable by conventional surface warfare. The armor around her main magazines is 16 inches of hardened steel, capable of defeating the largest naval gun shells then in service. She was, by every engineering measure available, the most formidable surface combatant ever constructed. The fuel loading, that morning, fills her bunkers with 2,332 tons of Bunker C heavy oil. A supplementary accounting note, sourced from post-war Japanese Navy fuel reviews, indicates that additional fuel scraped from reserve stocks brought the total to approximately 4,000 metric tons. It was not enough for a return voyage. Everyone involved knew this. The mission Yamato was being sent on, designated Operation Tengo, meaning Operation Heaven Number 1, called for her to sail south to Okinawa, engage the American fleet, and, when her ammunition was exhausted and damage made her unsustainable as a fighting platform, beach herself on the western coast of the island and use her guns as fixed shore artillery until she was destroyed. Her crew of approximately 3,300 men was going to Okinawa with fuel for a one-way trip and orders that ended with the ship's physical destruction. Naval staff discussions about the mission, preserved in post-war Japanese monographs prepared for American occupation authorities, record that junior officers raised objections to the plan. The objections were noted. The mission was approved. The logic that approved it was the logic of an institution that had decided, by April of 1945, that the demonstration of willingness to die mattered more than the rational assessment of tactical utility. Vice Admiral Seiichi Ito, Yamato's task force commander, reportedly expressed reservations about the mission in a final briefing at Tokuyama. He was told, in substance, that the Special Surface Attack Force was being committed as the naval equivalent of the Kamikaze program, a demonstration of sacrifice that would serve the broader strategic purpose of showing the American and Japanese publics alike that the Imperial Navy had not capitulated without spending everything available. There is something in that argument that is coherent in its way, and something that is deeply troubling. The crew of Yamato was not, at this point, being asked to perform a military operation with a realistic chance of success. They were being asked to perform an institutional gesture at the cost of their lives, to die in a way that would look meaningful, because meaningful-looking deaths were the only currency the Imperial Navy had left. I don't know how to assess that in purely historical terms, and I'm not sure anyone does. American submarines tracked the task force from the moment it left the inland sea on the afternoon of the 6th. Search aircraft from Mitch's Task Force 58 located it at approximately 0823 on the 7th of April as it moved south through the East China Sea. The attack began just after noon. 280 American aircraft, Helldiver dive bombers, Avenger torpedo bombers, and Hellcat fighters providing cover, came in coordinated waves. The Yamato's anti-aircraft batteries, of which she had a formidable complement, opened fire. The results against the scale of the attack were insufficient. The first wave of aerial torpedoes struck her port side within the first 20 minutes. She took 4 torpedo hits in the opening phase and began to list. Damage control parties sealed compartments, and the list was partially corrected. She was still moving south. She was still shooting. Yamato's torpedo protection system, the design engineering that was supposed to make her survivable against aerial torpedo attack, was built around a principle of progressive flooding absorption. The bulge system along her hull was designed to absorb 6 torpedo hits on one side before the flooding threatened her stability. In the action of the 7th of April, she absorbed 10 confirmed torpedo hits, in addition to multiple bomb hits. The engineering specification had been exceeded by roughly 67%. At approximately 14:23, with Yamato listing heavily to port and her speed reduced to the point where she was no longer effectively maneuverable, her forward magazine detonated. The explosion was visible from 100 miles away. It raised a column of smoke that American aviators, at altitude above the scene, described in their after-action reports with a mixture of precision and something that reads like involuntary awe. 2,747 of her crew of approximately 3,332 died. The surrounding task force, the light cruiser Yahagi, and several destroyers lost an additional 1,167 men. American losses were 10 aircraft and 12 men. The exchange ratio of that action, 12 American dead against nearly 4,000 Japanese dead, is the most lopsided in the history of naval warfare. It's also the wrong way to evaluate what happened. The mission wasn't designed to produce a favorable exchange ratio. It was designed to be sacrificed. Measuring its failure by the exchange ratio is measuring it against a standard its planners never intended to apply. The correct measure is whether the sacrifice accomplished its stated purpose, demonstrating Japanese resolve, raising the cost of the Okinawa operation, influencing American decision-making about what came next. By that measure, the question is more complicated. American naval commanders documented the loss of the task force with professional satisfaction. No surviving American record suggests that Yamato's sacrifice prompted any reconsideration of the operation's continuation. The gesture was made. Nobody on the receiving end was moved by it in the intended direction. When I was working through the engineering records of the attack, specifically the American aerial torpedo hit patterns reconstructed from pilot reports and post-action analysis, what struck me most wasn't the number of hits or the timing. It was the nature of the weapon being used. The Type 91 aerial torpedo, carried by American Avenger aircraft, had been specifically developed for the shallow water approach profiles required in harbor and coastal operations. At Okinawa, it was being used against a deep water target in open ocean, which meant it could run at its optimal depth rather than a shallow water modification. The weapon was functioning under ideal conditions. Yamato's protection system, for all its engineering sophistication, it had been designed around the assumption that the number of hits it would face was bounded by some realistic combat scenario. A battle where both sides were fighting conventionally and the attacker faced meaningful return fire. In the action of the 7th of April, 280 aircraft attacked a task force with minimal anti-aircraft capability and no air cover. The protection system's designers hadn't planned for 280 aircraft. Nobody who designed battleships in the 1930s had. 3 destroyers from the Yamato task force survived the attack and returned to Sasebo Harbor. When they arrived, by some accounts, the harbor command initially refused to believe the reports they brought. The Yamato was gone. The harbor command was still processing that information when the destroyers tied up at the dock. Those 3 ships spent the remainder of the war in Sasebo, immobilized by fuel shortage, and were scrapped by American occupation forces in 1947. The men who sailed back on them had survived something that virtually everyone around them had not, and they arrived home to find themselves in a country that was still fighting a war it had already lost and hadn't yet finished admitting it. The Yamato sits today on the floor of the East China Sea, approximately 180 miles southwest of Kyushu, at a depth of approximately 1,100 feet. She lies in 2 sections, the bow and the stern, separated by the explosion that destroyed her. Japanese deep-sea survey expeditions have located both pieces and documented their condition. The main battery turrets are visible in the survey footage, their 3-gun configurations still recognizable in the sediment. The 18.1-inch guns that never fired at a single Allied ship during the battle for which they made their final voyage are still there. 2 sections of a ship that was built to be the most powerful naval weapon in history and was sunk in 2 hours by aircraft pointing at nothing in 110 fathoms of water. Chapter 11. Coral and Mud. The Battle of Attrition in Numbers. The 4th week of May, 1945. Somewhere in the Service Squadron 10 Forward Logistics area in the East China Sea, a supply officer is reviewing his weekly summary sheets. The format is standard Navy logistics paperwork, Columns for commodity type, stock level, weekly consumption, resupply estimate. This document doesn't describe the battle. It describes what the battle is consuming. Artillery ammunition, column 7 of the weekly summary for the week of the 12th through 18th of May, shows 10th Army consumption for that period at approximately 1,193,000 rounds. The estimated forward area stock is listed as approximately 4.2 weeks at current consumption rates. Below that entry, in what appears to be a handwritten annotation rather than a typed addendum, someone has written, "Request priority reallocation of APA, shipping from Philippine theater." Not a frantic request, not an alarmed request, a professional request in the appropriate register from a man doing the math and finding that it requires attention. This is the sound of a battle that is very large and still going. The total artillery expenditure for the Okinawa campaign, across all calibers, all units, all 82 days, amounts to approximately 7.5 million rounds of tube artillery alone, including naval gunfire support and mortar ammunition. The total approaches something in the range of 8.5 million projectiles fired by American forces at the island. At an average weight of 20 pounds per round for the most common calibers, this represents roughly 83,000 tons of explosive ordnance delivered into an island 60 miles long and roughly 12 miles wide. That figure is difficult to contextualize, so here is one attempt. It is more explosive ordnance than the entire Western Front received in the opening year of the First World War. It was fired into a limestone terrain where the primary defensive positions were underground, immune to anything short of a direct tunnel penetration, and emerged each morning still fully operational. 83,000 tons of ordnance, and the Japanese kept shooting back for 11 weeks. The weekly American casualty figures for the Okinawa campaign tell a specific story that the campaign totals tend to obscure. The first week's totals, the week of the Easter Sunday landing and the unopposed advance inland, are relatively low as the 10th Army was still crossing open ground before encountering the Shuri Line. By the week of the 10th through 16th of May, the heaviest fighting week of the campaign, American casualties across all services were running at a rate that the 10th Army surgeon's final report describes, in the careful language of medical record keeping, as approaching maximum sustainable throughput for forward surgical hospitals. Maximum sustainable throughput. That's the medical system's way of saying it was nearly overwhelmed. The surgical teams were processing casualties at a rate that left almost no slack in the system. A significant spike in admissions could have pushed the medical infrastructure into a state where people died waiting for surgery who wouldn't otherwise have needed to. It didn't quite get there. It was close. The psychiatric casualty figure, 26,211 non-battle casualties including combat fatigue, breakdown, and related presentations, deserves the sustained attention it rarely receives. This number represents approximately 14% of the entire 10th Army. Army psychiatrists embedded with combat units during the campaign filed real-time observational reports that are now available through the National Archives Medical Records Collection, and they contain passages that are striking for their clinical precision about what prolonged exposure to the specific conditions of the Shuri Line was doing to the men inside it. The combination of constant artillery noise from both sides, the inability to move freely during daylight hours due to Japanese observed fire, the mud that made everything slower and harder, the specific challenge of seeing casualties who couldn't be evacuated quickly and remaining functional. These factors in combination were producing what the reports describe as a qualitatively distinct clinical profile from what had been observed in previous Pacific campaigns. The psychiatrists were describing, in medical language, the experience of being in a machine that was consuming human beings at a rate that the human beings inside it could register even if they couldn't stop it. When I was working through the compiled casualty figures alongside the weekly supply summaries, I kept returning to one specific data point that doesn't appear in most accounts of the campaign. The number of Japanese prisoners taken during the entire Okinawa campaign was approximately 7,400. Against a Japanese force estimated at roughly 110,000, this represents a capture rate of less than 7%. The other 93%, more than 100,000 people, either died in combat, were buried in collapsed tunnels, or were never formally accounted for in any document that survived the battle. 7% captured, 93% not captured, in circumstances that the surviving records can't fully document for the vast majority of cases. That single ratio tells you more about the nature of the fighting in the tunnels and caves of southern Okinawa than any tactical narrative I've encountered in the literature. It tells you that this was not a battle in which men surrendered often. It was a battle in which men died. The Okinawa campaign's logistical achievement is one of the most underappreciated aspects of the entire Pacific War, and I want to spend a moment on it because it provides essential context for understanding how the battle was sustained for 82 days at the consumption rates the supply records document. Reservist Squadron 10, the forward logistics fleet that maintained the supply chain from Pearl Harbor to the operating area, was executing underway replenishment operations simultaneously with fleet combat operations for the first time in this scale in military history. Ammunition ships were transferring rounds to bombardment vessels, while kamikaze attacks were ongoing at nearby picket stations. Food and medical supplies were moving from transport ships to beach parties on amphibious vessels, while Japanese artillery was covering the beaches. The administrative machinery of the operation was running alongside the combat machinery in the same physical space, and the people keeping the supply chain functional. The logistics officers, the ammunition handlers, the CBs reconstructing airfields, the postal workers sorting and distributing 4 million pieces of mail, were doing their work inside the same threat environment as the rifle companies. Their names tend not to appear in campaign histories with the same frequency as those of the tactical commanders. They should. The Japanese supply situation, as I noted earlier in this documentary, was the inverse of the American one. The 32nd Army's 11,065 tons of pre-positioned artillery ammunition was the sum total of what Ushijima had to work with. No resupply reached Okinawa by sea after the American landings. The naval blockade and American air superiority made maritime resupply essentially impossible. By mid-May, she captured Japanese supply records and prisoner interrogations were suggesting to American intelligence that the Japanese ammunition situation was becoming critical. The captured documents weren't always reliable indicators. Prisoner accounts varied, and the Japanese had reasons to mislead. But the overall trajectory was clear. The Shuri Line was being sustained by a fixed stockpile that was being drawn down at a rate that could be calculated. The American supply line was being sustained by a logistics infrastructure that could be replenished indefinitely. The battle of attrition that Yahara had designed was going to run to its mathematical conclusion, and the conclusion was determined by the ratio of stockpile to daily consumption, not by the tactical courage of either side. Both sides had that in abundance. Only one side had the logistics. The most consequential week of American casualties during the campaign, the week of the major Sugarloaf fighting, the won-a-draw engagements, and the simultaneous operations across the full width of the Shuri Line, produced a casualty rate that brought the 10th Army's medical system to what the surgeon's report called its operational limit. Those are the numbers. Behind the numbers are the specific individual transactions of the medical system that week. The triage decisions made in forward surgical hospitals, the cases where the available capacity determined outcomes, the men who were at the front of the queue and the men who weren't. Military medicine in 1945 was working at the edge of what its equipment and personnel could do, in conditions that the planners had anticipated in their casualty estimates, and that were, in the worst weeks, reaching or approaching those estimates. The planners had been right about the numbers. Being right about numbers in that context means that the people whose deaths make the numbers accurate were doing exactly what the plan foresaw. There is a detail from the Okinawa campaign that I find the most effective single illustration of what the arithmetic of the battle meant in human terms. The United States Army Postal Service, as I mentioned in an earlier chapter, delivered approximately 4.2 million pieces of mail to Okinawa between April and June of 1945. Of those, an estimated 37,000 pieces were returned undeliverable because the recipient was deceased, wounded, or missing. A 37,000 is approximately 0.9% of 4.2 million, less than 1%. From a logistical perspective, that's an extraordinary delivery success rate. From any other perspective, 37,000 people who were alive when their mail was sent weren't alive when it arrived. The Postal Service called it an undeliverable rate. The rest of us might call it a list. Chapter 12. The Confederate Flag on Shuri Castle. The Fall of the Shuri Line. The 29th of May, 1945. Just after 10 o'clock in the morning, the ruins of Shuri Castle, southern Okinawa. Company A of the 1st Battalion, 5th Marines, 1st Marine Division, has entered the castle complex through a gap in the outer wall, advancing faster than planned in the rain-grey morning, exploiting a momentary weakness in a collapsing Japanese defensive line. The castle itself, built in the 14th century by the Ryukyuan kings as the seat of their island civilization, a structure that had stood through centuries of typhoon and political upheaval and the end of an entire kingdom, is a wreck. The upper structures are gone. The ancient stonework has been shredded by weeks of naval and artillery bombardment. What's left is the lower foundation system and a series of battered parapets, still recognizable in their rough geometry, standing in the middle of a landscape that looks like no landscape at all anymore. The company commander of Company A, Captain Julian Dusenbury of South Carolina, reaches the parapet first. He raises a flag. It is not the American flag. It is a Confederate battle flag, which he has been carrying as a personal souvenir from somewhere earlier in his service. For several hours, the battle flag of the Confederacy flies over the ruins of the ancient castle of the Ryukyu Kingdom, on a Japanese island in the East China Sea. General Buckner is informed. He orders it removed. The brief life of that flag above Shuri Castle is one of those historical details that resist the clean interpretive categories that war narratives tend to prefer. It wasn't a political statement, exactly. Dusenbury appears, from the accounts that survive, to have raised it in the spontaneous exuberance of a man whose company had just taken a significant objective ahead of schedule, reaching for the most immediately available symbol of personal identity and regional pride. It wasn't insignificant either. Buckner's response, his written order directing the Confederate flag replaced with the national flag, and his note that the Confederate banner was inappropriate and demoralizing to certain elements of our force, is a piece of official documentation that acknowledges, in the careful language of command correspondence, that the United States military in 1945 was conducting a war for democracy while carrying unresolved democratic contradictions inside its own ranks. The order is in the 10th Army's administrative file. It doesn't need to be interpreted. It says what it says. Shuri Castle had been the anchor of the entire Japanese defensive network since before the battle began. 150 feet below the ruined structure, the 32nd Army's tunnel headquarters had operated for 83 days. The chambers that had housed Ushijima's operations staff, his communications equipment, his medical facilities, that had absorbed direct naval shell hits without structural failure, were still down there when Company A walked through the outer wall. American engineers who descended into them in the following days found the tunnels largely intact, their internal organization still legible, the detritus of a military headquarters that had been vacated in an orderly withdrawal rather than destroyed in place. The tunnel complex had done exactly what it was designed to do. It had protected the army that sheltered in it until that army chose to leave. Ushijima's withdrawal from Shuri had begun in the final days of May under heavy rain. The Okinawan rainy season in full force, she transforming the roads to mud and reducing visibility to the point where the American air observation that would normally have detected and interdicted a major troop movement was effectively neutralized. Approximately 30,000 surviving Japanese soldiers moved south through the rain over 3 nights, carrying what they could, leaving behind the 3,200 tons of ammunition they couldn't transport. That figure, 3,200 tons abandoned, appears in American supply records when Army engineers entered the Shuri tunnel complex and assessed what the Japanese had left. It was approximately 29% of the original pre-battle ammunition stockpile, left in place not because Ushijima was done fighting, but because there wasn't enough transport capacity to move it south in the time available. He took 71% of his original supply with him to the Mabuni Hills. He was going to keep fighting. When I was working through the American divisional records from the Shuri assault period and comparing them against the timeline of the Japanese withdrawal, one operational detail kept attracting my attention. The 10th Army, exhausted from 3 weeks of Shuri Line fighting, was not in a condition to mount an aggressive pursuit of a withdrawing force. The divisions that had bled through the Sugarloaf complex and the Wana Draw engagements needed time to reorganize, resupply, and rotate units before they could push south effectively. This is completely understandable. These were not fresh forces, and pushing exhausted infantry aggressively against a rearguard would have been costly. But the practical consequence is that Ushijima got his 30,000 men out of Shuri largely intact and arrived at the Mabuni Hills with enough ammunition and enough organized formations to extend the battle by another 3 weeks. The Shuri Line didn't fall. It relocated. The fighting didn't end. It compressed. Now there is a technical aspect of Shuri Castle's construction that I find genuinely remarkable in the context of this battle, and it connects the 14th century to 1945 in a way that no one planned and no one could have predicted. The Ryukyuan castle architecture used in the original Shuri structure employed a technique called nokoshi, a dry stone fitting method using large coral limestone blocks shaped to interlock without mortar. The castle's outer walls, at their base, were up to 3 meters thick. American engineers who surveyed the ruins after the battle noted that while the upper structures had been completely destroyed, significant portions of the lower foundation walls and the underground drainage channels dating from the castle's medieval construction period were essentially intact. The Japanese military engineers building the tunnel complex under Shuri had in several places incorporated those original drainage channels into their modern tunnel design, effectively extending a 14th century infrastructure network into a 20th century military command facility. The builders of the original castle had, inadvertently, constructed something that would still be structurally useful when 16-inch naval shells were detonating above it 600 years later. Lieutenant Colonel Richard P. Ross, Jr., commanding the 1st Battalion, 5th Marines, raised the American flag over the castle parapet on the 29th of May, replacing the Confederate flag that Dusenberry had put there hours earlier. The photograph of that moment, Ross braving Japanese sniper fire to place the flag, was transmitted and published. It became one of the signature images of the Okinawa campaign. The Confederate flag photograph also existed, and it also circulated, though in a more limited way. In the years and decades after the battle, the Confederate flag moment at Shuri Castle appeared occasionally in accounts of the campaign, and then receded again. One of those details that doesn't fit the narrative of the battle that most people want to tell, and that consequently tends to get omitted from the version of the story that travels. The photograph is in the archives. The moment happened. The war that produced it was more complicated than the photographs suggest. The fall of Shuri, the official fall, the moment when American forces confirmed they held the castle complex and the surrounding ridgeline, marked the end of the central phase of the battle, but not its end. What came next was in some ways the most difficult phase of all, the pursuit of a still organized enemy into the most complex terrain on the island, against a force that had managed to preserve its command structure and a significant portion of its ammunition supply through a successful night withdrawal under rain. The 10th Army that moved south from Shuri in early June was a different army than the one that had landed on the 1st of April. Older in the way that combat makes men old, for thinner in its unit rosters, shorter in its tolerance for the kind of administrative friction that seems minor when men aren't dying and significant when they are. The hills ahead were smaller than the Shuri Line. They were not, by any meaningful measure, easier. The secondary explosions from the abandoned Japanese ammunition in the Shuri tunnel complex continued for 48 hours after American forces entered the castle grounds. Demolition teams worked through them systematically, destroying what couldn't be secured and documenting what could. The documentation, the engineering assessments, the captured supply inventories, the translated headquarters materials filled several volumes of technical reporting that fed into the post-battle analysis of the 32nd Army's defensive system. Those reports are thorough, and they are illuminating in the clinical sense. They tell you what was there and in what quantities. What they don't tell you, and can't, is what it meant to the men who built it. The Okinawan civilians who dug the tunnels by hand in the summer and autumn of 1944, who went underground with picks and pneumatic drills and the understanding that they were digging the infrastructure of a battle that would happen in the place where they lived to the people they knew. Shuri Castle has been destroyed and rebuilt multiple times across its history. The structure that stood in 1944 was itself a reconstruction built after an earlier destruction. The structure destroyed in 1945 was rebuilt again by the Okinawan prefectural government, reopening in 1992 and designated a UNESCO World Heritage Site in 2000. In 2019, it caught fire, an electrical fault in the newly rebuilt structure, and burned again. As of the mid-2020s, it is under reconstruction for the third time in modern history. The castle has been built, destroyed, and rebuilt with a persistence that looks almost deliberate from a historical distance, as if the place itself has decided that being present matters more than remaining intact. Chapter 13. The Last Tigers, Japan's Final Ground Counteroffensive. The 3rd of May, 1945. Just before midnight, inside the 32nd Army Command Post under Shuri Castle, a staff conference is in progress, and it isn't going well. Colonel Hiromichi Yahara has made his argument against the planned counteroffensive for what the record suggests was not the first time. He has laid out the arithmetic, the forces available, the American artillery density, the coordination problems in the assault schedule, the near certainty of catastrophic losses for no proportional tactical gain. General Cho, the Chief of Staff, has listened and overruled him. General Ushijima has considered both positions and sided with Cho. The counteroffensive will proceed on the 4th of May. Approximately 2 days later, the 32nd Army will have spent 7,000 men it can't replace in an operation that Yahara had predicted, with precision, would accomplish nothing of military value. What fascinates me about this moment, and I've returned to it many times in Yahara's memoir and in the translated staff records, is that the decision-making process was not irrational by the standards of the institution producing it. It was irrational by external military standards. From inside the Imperial Army's command culture, there was a logic to it, an understanding that logic is essential to understanding everything about how the Japanese fought this battle. The Type 97 Chiha medium tank, which formed the primary armoured component of the Japanese counteroffensive on the 4th of May, was a competent weapon by the standards of the mid-1930s when it was designed. It weighed 15.8 metric tons. Its maximum armour thickness was 57 millimeters. Its main armament was a 47 millimeter gun, capable of engaging light vehicles and field fortifications. By 1945, in the context of a battle against the American 10th Army, these specifications were not competitive. The M4A3 Sherman tank, deployed by American armoured units at Okinawa, weighed 30.3 metric tons, nearly twice the Chiha's weight, carried 76 millimeters of frontal armour, and mounted a 75 millimeter main gun that could penetrate the Chiha's maximum armour at ranges up to 1,000 yards. The engagement distance at which a Chiha could threaten a Sherman was a fraction of the distance at which a Sherman could destroy a Chiha. When the Type 97 tanks rolled forward on the morning of the 4th, the outcome of their armoured engagements was not a matter of tactics. It was a matter of physics. The infantry dimension of the May 4th counteroffensive was supposed to complement the armoured advance. Coordinated assaults along multiple axes, timed to exploit the American response to the tank movements. The coordination broke down almost immediately. Japanese infantry units that were supposed to be at their jump-off positions at 5:30 in the morning were still moving to position when the assault was meant to begin. Some units had been disrupted by American artillery during the pre-dawn movement. Others had difficulty navigating in the dark across terrain that had been significantly altered by weeks of bombardment. The coordination that existed on the planning map, the clean, simultaneous arrows of a staff officer's assault diagram, dissolved in the reality of exhausted infantry units trying to move across cratered ground in the dark, while American illumination rounds turned the sky intermittently white. By mid-morning, the counteroffensive had degenerated from a coordinated multi-axis assault into a series of isolated engagements in which American forces held the advantage in every relevant dimension: firepower, position, communications, and supply. The American M10 tank destroyer that engaged Japanese armor during the 4th of May counteroffensive was built on the M4A3 Sherman chassis and armed with the M7 3-inch gun. The M7 fired an armor-piercing round at a muzzle velocity of approximately 793 meters per second, sufficient to defeat any Japanese armor in the Pacific Theater at engagement ranges well beyond what the terrain in southern Okinawa typically permitted. The M10 was open-topped, which made it vulnerable to artillery airbursts and grenades from above. But the Japanese artillery support for the counteroffensive, never fully coordinated to begin with, didn't have the organization during the actual fighting to exploit that vulnerability systematically. The M10's open turret became a theoretical problem that the Japanese never had the tactical coherence to turn into an operational one. Yahara's memoir describes the days following the counteroffensive with a restraint that I find more damning than anger would be. He records the casualty figures. He records the failure of the objectives. He notes that his prediction of the outcome proved accurate. And then he returns to the description of the remaining defensive tasks with the quiet professionalism of a man who has been overruled by his commanders and has decided that the most constructive response available to him is to continue his professional duties as effectively as possible. What he doesn't do is describe what it felt like to watch 7,000 men die in an operation he had formerly opposed. The memoir doesn't give you that. What it gives you instead is a document of sustained military competence operating inside an institution that was making decisions that competence alone couldn't correct. The Japanese 32nd Army's total casualties from the May 4th counteroffensive are estimated at between 5,000 and 7,000 killed over the two-day period. American casualties for the same period, the 10th Army's own records, show approximately 714 killed and 2,319 wounded. These are serious numbers by any normal measure of battle. They are considerably less than the losses sustained during the same number of days of Shuri Line fighting. Less than a single bad day at Sugarloaf. The operation that Ushijima's chief of staff had pressed for, that Yahara had formally opposed, that consumed a significant fraction of the Japanese forces' remaining infantry strength, produced American casualties that were, in relative terms, among the more favorable exchange ratios of the entire campaign for the American side. The Japanese official accounts prepared after the war describe the counteroffensive as having achieved significant attrition of American forces. The American casualty records don't support that characterization. When I look at the captured Japanese unit records from the immediate aftermath of the counteroffensive, translated documents that are now in the National Archives, what strikes me most is a logistical detail that appears in several different unit quartermaster reports. The counteroffensive had consumed ammunition at a rate that the 32nd Army's supply situation couldn't afford. Units that had advanced, engaged American positions, and been driven back had expended their per-unit ammunition allocations and were requesting resupply that in several cases the Army-level supply couldn't provide at the quantities needed. The 11,000 tons of pre-positioned ammunition that had seemed so formidable when the battle began was now, after 6 weeks of Shuri Line fighting, plus the counteroffensive expenditure, visibly finite. The counteroffensive hadn't just cost men. It had drawn down the stockpile that was the entire logistical foundation of the remaining defense. Yahara had understood this. The argument he lost in the late-night staff meeting on the 3rd of May cost the 32nd Army more than the men who died in the assault. It cost the duration of the defensive battle itself. Yahara's account of his own survival is one of the more extraordinary individual stories in the entire Okinawa campaign. When Ushijima issued his final orders to remaining officers, directing them to die either in a final assault or by their own hand, Yahara requested permission to survive in order to provide formal testimony of the battle for the historical record. Ushijima granted this. Yahara disguised himself as a civilian and attempted to escape through the American lines. He was captured several days later and was recognized by American intelligence officers who had studied his work. He spent the remainder of the war in American custody, was repatriated after the peace, and spent decades compiling his account of the battle. His memoir was published in Japanese in 1973. The English translation appeared in 1995. Some Japanese veterans and commentators characterized his survival as dishonor, a failure to follow the command's final instructions. Yahara characterized it as the fulfillment of a professional duty to preserve accurate testimony. Whatever one makes of that disagreement, the practical consequence is clear. Because Yahara survived and wrote, we have a detailed, candid, first-person account of the 32nd Army's command decisions from the inside. Without him, the Japanese side of this story would be almost entirely reconstructed from captured documents and prisoner interrogations. He is the reason the history of the battle is as complete as it is. The hills south of Shuri, where the final phase of the battle was fought, have none of the names that Sugarloaf and Hacksaw Ridge carry in the historical record. They have local Okinawan place names, Yaeju, Yuza, Daka, and they appear in the campaign histories as the sites of the battle's final weeks. The costly grinding advance that followed the Shuri withdrawal. The Japanese defenders in those hills were fighting with dwindling ammunition, diminishing food supplies, and no prospect of reinforcement or relief. They fought anyway. The Americans advancing against them were fighting with full supply lines, continuous air support, and clear momentum. They still took casualties at a rate that would have been unacceptable in any other theatre, in any other campaign, in any other year of the war. Both sides were, in the final weeks of May and June, doing something that had already been decided by the mathematics of the Shuri stockpile and the American logistics chain, executing the final acts of an equation whose result had been determined before the shooting started, without anyone being able to stop. Chapter 14. Typhoon. Nature joins the battle. The 4th of June, 1945. Somewhere in the East China Sea, northwest of Okinawa. The fleet weather log at SINCPAC's forward headquarters records sustained winds of 55 knots from the north-northeast. Wave height in the operating area is estimated at 12 to 15 feet. The term for what is happening is Typhoon Kora, though the name came later. In the operational moment, it was simply a tropical disturbance that had strengthened into something that no ship wanted to be near and no airfield could function in. The 10th Army, 30 miles to the south, has been fighting in continuous rain for 3 weeks already. The Okinawan rainy season is a meteorological fact, not a dramatic embellishment. But this is something qualitatively different. This is the ocean arriving on the land, the wind arriving on the fleet. The war paused not by human decision, but by something that doesn't know about the war and couldn't care less. The practical consequences of Typhoon Kora for the campaign were specific and measurable, and I want to be precise about them because they tend to appear in general histories as atmosphere, as background color between the tactical chapters, when they were, in fact, operationally significant. 36 vessels were either sunk or significantly damaged. Supply deliveries to the operating area were interrupted for approximately 48 hours. The 10th Army's forward ammunition and provisions stockpile, which had been drawn down by the Shuri assault and was being replenished as fast as the logistics chain allowed, dropped to what the supplies summaries describe as a 4-day safety reserve in some forward areas during the disruption. 4 days is not a comfortable margin for an army in active combat. It's the kind of margin that makes supply officers write urgent requests in the language of professional alarm. Several such requests appear in the period's logistics archive, and the tone of them is notably different from the routine weekly summaries that preceded the storm. The mud at Okinawa, which predated the typhoon and outlasted it because the rainy season continued, was a combatant in the most literal operational sense. The Okinawan rainy season, called Suyu in Japanese, typically deposits 12 to 18 inches of precipitation over a 6-week period running from mid-May to late June. The battle's most intensive ground phase fell almost precisely within that window. American wheeled vehicles were immobilized on roads that turned to axle-deep slurry within hours of rain. Tracked vehicles that could continue moving were tearing up the road surfaces further, making them impassable for the wheeled supply vehicles that followed. The standard Marine Corps field diary for mid-May describes a logistics situation in which the gap between what was needed at the front and what could physically be delivered was being managed by substitution. Different calibers replacing the preferred rounds, reduced rations, delayed equipment replacements, rather than resolution. The supply chain was functioning. It was functioning with more friction than anyone would have chosen. The CBs, the Naval Construction Battalions, are the operational response to that friction that the historical record doesn't adequately honor. Naval Construction Battalion 125 at Yontan Airfield received the typhoon's damage assessment in the early hours of the 5th of June. The pierced steel planking on the main runway had buckled at several stations. WW2 fuel storage points had been compromised, and the drainage system that kept the runway surface from flooding was partially blocked by debris. The engineering assessment, the official estimate of minimum repair time, was 72 hours. The NCB-125 completed the repairs in 68 hours. They worked through the typhoon's trailing rain bands, using gasoline-powered floodlights and relief rotations on 4-hour shifts. Pierced steel planking, the interlocking metal strip system that gave Pacific Island runways their rapid construction capability, could propagate damage from a 40-foot buckle outward for 200 feet in either direction, if not corrected quickly. Because the interlocking system that made it strong also meant that a structural failure in one section pulled at the adjacent sections. The NCB crew knew this and worked accordingly. When I was working through the CB unit diaries from the typhoon period, alongside the operational records of the air units that depended on Yontan, I was struck by a specific temporal detail that the aviation history rarely acknowledges. The 68 hours during which Yontan was operating at reduced capacity corresponded to a period when the ground forces south of the airfield were in an active operational phase, pushing south from Shuri toward the Mabuni Hills, with Japanese resistance organized in the Uzadake escarpment system. The close air support that American infantry had depended on throughout the campaign was degraded precisely when the operational tempo required it most. The CBs closing that gap in 68 rather than 72 hours was not a dramatic act. It was a competent one, performed by men whose names don't appear in campaign histories and whose contribution was measured in hours rather than medals. Those 4 hours may or may not have mattered operationally. The probability that they did is not negligible. The typhoon also inflicted specific damage on the offshore supply vessels in ways the ground force histories tend to omit. Several landing ships and smaller supply craft, caught without sufficient sea room to maneuver, were driven onto shoal water or against other vessels. The operational reports describe loss of cargo, vehicles, ammunition pallets, medical supplies, that had to be replaced from reserve stocks before forward delivery schedules could be restored. The individual items lost to storm damage don't have their own records, the way individual human casualties do. A lost pallet of mortar ammunition doesn't generate a notification telegram or a service record entry. It's entered as a supply variance, an inventory difference, a number in a column. The men who needed those rounds on the morning of the 6th of June and found the resupply delayed by a number that would eventually be reconciled in a logistical spreadsheet. Their experience of that delay is not in any document I've found. There is a detail from the meteorological record of the Okinawa campaign that tends not to appear in campaign histories, but that I think belongs here. The rainy season timing, the Suyu window, was a known quantity before the operation began. Pre-invasion planning studies noted the seasonal precipitation data for Okinawa and included it in the environmental assessment sections of the operational planning documents. Those sections recommended, in at least one instance, a March landing date as preferable to April from the perspective of weather window. The April 1st date was chosen for other reasons: tidal calculations, logistical readiness, coordination timelines. The choice was defensible. Its consequence, in the weeks that followed, was a battle fought largely in mud. The mud was predictable. It was predicted. The men who fought in it didn't get a vote on the date. Sledge's memoir, which I keep returning to because it remains the most honest prose account of what the ground experience of this campaign actually felt like, has a passage from the Okinawa mud fighting that I find more accurate than any weather report. He writes that the mud was alive, not a metaphor, or not only a metaphor. He means it literally as an observation about what warm, saturated, decomposing ground in a subtropical rainy season, churned by tracked vehicles and saturated with the residue of weeks of combat, actually becomes when you're living in it and moving through it every day. The Army medical report from the same period uses the clinical language of epidemiology to describe the same observation: elevated wound infection rates, accelerated bacterial contamination, specific health presentations consistent with prolonged exposure to contaminated water and soil. The medical report and the memoir are describing the same material reality from different registers. Both are accurate. Sledge's 4 words carry more information, I think. The typhoon passed. The rain continued. The supply chain was restored. The airfields were repaired. The campaign moved south. In the broader calendar of the Pacific War, Typhoon Kora is a footnote, a weather disruption during the final phase of the last major island battle. In the operational record of the Okinawa campaign, it's a week's worth of delayed supply, damaged vessels, closed airfields, and degraded close air support, at a moment when the operational tempo couldn't afford the degradation. The 10-hour difference between the CB's 72-hour estimate and their 68-hour performance, 4 hours returned to the operational schedule by men with tools and floodlights and no particular desire to be remembered for it, is the kind of detail that the campaign's historiography can't accommodate, and that the battle's actual outcome depended on, in ways that are real even if they're unquantifiable. Chapter 15. The General's Choice. Ushijima's Last Cave. The 22nd of June, 1945. Before dawn. A flat rock at the base of Hill 89 on the Mabuni Peninsula, southern Okinawa, approximately 500 meters from the coast of the Pacific Ocean. The sky is beginning to lighten. The battle, by any practical military measure, is over. American forces control every significant ridge and position on the island. The organized resistance of the 32nd Army has collapsed over the preceding week into small, scattered groups moving through the caves and gullies of the island's southernmost tip. There are still men alive down there in the rocks and the darkness. There are still Japanese soldiers who will fight for another week, another 2 weeks, in isolated pockets that will be cleared one by one. But as an army, as a unified command with operational coherence, the 32nd Army ceased to exist sometime in the previous 48 hours. Ushijima knows this. He is dressed in his full dress uniform. He is sitting on the flat rock. The ceremony he is about to perform has not changed materially since the 16th century. The final communications from the Japanese 32nd Army to Imperial General Headquarters, transmitted in the final hours of the 22nd of June, contain a passage that has been translated and quoted in various forms in the campaign histories. The message acknowledges the exhaustion of the defensive capacity. It expresses what the military language of the Imperial Army designates as loyalty. It ends. What the message doesn't contain, what the formal register of Imperial military communication couldn't accommodate, is any accounting for what the defense of Okinawa had cost the people who actually lived on Okinawa. The civilians in the caves at Mabuni, the Himayuri students disbanded into the battle zone with their discharge papers, the farm families who spent April and May in drainage ditches. The final transmission of the 32nd Army is a document addressed to an institution from an institution in the language of institutional honor. The people the battle consumed are not in it. The Hill 89 command complex was a 3-level tunnel system under the Mabuni Hill mass, approximately 30 meters underground at its deepest, capable of housing several hundred personnel. By the final week of June, it housed considerably fewer. The surviving combat staff, the communications section, the medical team, and approximately 10 to 15,000 sick and wounded men who had been moved south from Shuri and could go no further. The tunnel walls were damp. The ventilation was inadequate. American forces were within artillery range and had been for days. Ushijima had approximately 30,000 soldiers remaining, a figure that included large numbers of wounded, conscripted labor and administrative personnel whose combat effectiveness was limited. Against them, the 10th Army was now fully resupplied, reinforced by the 8th Marines who had arrived fresh from Saipan, and supported by naval gunfire that could cover every visible position on the Mabuni Peninsula. The debate among the Japanese staff in the final days, whether to attempt a breakout to the north, to continue fighting from the current positions, or to proceed to the ritual ending, is documented in partial form through the accounts of several surviving staff officers, including the record preserved in the Yahara memoir and in the oral history compiled from other surviving personnel. Ushijima is described in these accounts as a man who had moved past the deliberative phase of command, who was executing a decision already arrived at, with the characteristic composure that the memoirs consistently attribute to him. His chief of staff, Cho, by contrast, is described in multiple accounts as physically worn and emotionally volatile in the final days. The two men who had commanded the 32nd Army together, the steady general and the aggressive chief of staff who had pushed for the counter-offensive Yahara opposed, were making their final dispositions with the same qualities that had defined them throughout. On the 18th of June, 3 days before the battle officially concluded, General Buckner had been killed at a forward observation post. A Japanese artillery round, the 5th in a salvo, had struck a coral rock near the position and sent fragments in multiple directions. Buckner was hit and lost consciousness within minutes, dying shortly after. He was 58 years old. He was the highest-ranking American officer killed by enemy action during the entire Second World War. The timing was, in a purely historical sense, extraordinary. The battle was functionally over. The Shuri Line had fallen. The Japanese resistance was collapsing. Buckner died within sight of the campaign's end, without seeing it formally reached. The official record notes his death. notes his succession by General Geiger, and continues with the operational narrative. What it can't record is the particular weight of dying 3 days before the end of a battle you had commanded for 11 weeks, having been right or wrong about how to fight it, never knowing which. I find myself genuinely uncertain about Ushijima in a way that I think honest historical practice requires acknowledging. He designed and executed a defensive strategy that killed approximately 100,000 of his own soldiers and contributed to the deaths of between 40,000 and 150,000 Okinawan civilians. He did so while opposing the one major tactical deviation from that strategy, the May 4th counteroffensive that cost Japanese lives most obviously in excess of any military necessity. He maintained the composure of professional command throughout a battle that consumed everything placed in his charge. He died by ritual suicide, dressed in his best uniform at dawn, having transmitted his final loyalty to an institution that had asked him to hold Okinawa and had given him no way to do it that didn't involve catastrophic loss. Whether the strategy he executed was courageous or criminal, or whether it was both simultaneously, which is the answer I keep arriving at, is a question that the historical record poses without resolving. General Cho had in the days before the end composed a death poem. This was a practice with deep roots in the Japanese military tradition, a final formal expression in the compressed form of verse of one's state of mind at the threshold of death. Cho's poem, preserved in the translated records, mourns the island in natural terms, its sea breeze, its clouds, its color. It was written by a man who bore significant responsibility for the conditions that had produced the civilian catastrophe around him, and it mourns the island without reference to those conditions. The poem is genuine. The surviving accounts suggest he composed it seriously. It's also incomplete in the way that any final statement is incomplete when the person making it has omitted the most consequential things about what they've done. Both things are true simultaneously. The poem is real, and its silence on the civilian dead is real. American forces found the site of Ushijima's death approximately 2 hours after the ceremony ended. A witness account from a soldier whose report is preserved in the National Archives describes the scene in specific terms: the flat rock at the base of Hill 89, the marks on the rock from the ceremony itself. Nearby, what the witness described as a meal laid out neatly: rice, canned fruit, arranged with the care of a table set for guests. Whether the meal was a final personal ritual or the remnant of a breakfast interrupted by the ceremony's preparation, the account doesn't say. The witness found it the most disturbing detail he had encountered in 11 weeks on Okinawa. I've thought about that observation often. After everything he had seen, everything that the campaign records document, from the beaches to the ridgelines to the caves, the thing that stayed with him was a neatly arranged meal beside a flat rock, the ordinariness of it in the middle of all that violence, the domesticity that persisted right to the end. The battle was officially declared over on the 22nd of June, 1945. The island of Okinawa had been in American hands, in practical terms, for several weeks before that date. But the 22nd is the date marked in the campaign histories, the date that derives from Ushijima's death and the concurrent formal collapse of organized Japanese resistance. 82 days. From the Easter Sunday landing to this flat rock at dawn. The total human cost across all categories and both sides runs to something in the range of 240,000 dead. Soldiers, sailors, airmen, conscripts, and civilians. With the uncertainty ranges I described in an earlier chapter, compounding the difficulty of stating a precise figure. What's certain is the order of magnitude. What's certain is that most of those deaths happened in a space roughly the size of Los Angeles, in less than 3 months, in the spring of a year when everybody involved knew the war was already decided. Chapter 16. The Phantom Invasion. What Okinawa Made Inevitable, Washington, D.C., June 1945. The Joint War Plans Committee, a body whose existence most Americans have never heard of, and whose work in the summer of 1945 may represent the most consequential staff analysis ever produced by the United States government, is compiling a document. The document has a designation and a date and a classification level, and it contains, on page 7 of its 14 pages, a table. The table is headed Estimated American Casualties in Operations Against Japan, and it gives figures for Operation Olympic, the planned invasion of Kyushu, target date the 1st of November 1945. The low estimate in the table is 250,000 American casualties. The high estimate is 1 million. Below the table, in language that connects this document directly to the battle just described in the previous 16 chapters of this documentary, a notation explains the basis for the calculations. The methodology is described as Okinawa loss rate multiplied by area ratio. The people who died on the ridgelines of southern Okinawa, whose names are on the cornerstone of peace, whose deaths are in the casualty tables and the mail records and the chaplain's reports. Their deaths became, in that staff notation, the unit of measurement for the most consequential military decision of the 20th century. Operation Downfall, the invasion of the Japanese home islands, was planned in 2 phases. Operation Olympic would seize the island of Kyushu in the south, providing the air and logistics base for the 2nd phase. Operation Coronet would then land on Honshu and advance on Tokyo. The combined planning called for approximately 767,000 assault troops for Olympic alone, more than 4 times the Okinawa force, operating against a Japanese homeland defense that American codebreakers had been monitoring with increasing accuracy throughout the summer of 1945. What the codebreakers were finding was alarming. The Japanese had identified the most likely landing beaches on Kyushu with remarkable precision using aerial surveys and geographic analysis, and were positioning 14 divisions, roughly matching the Allied landing force, directly behind those beaches. The Okinawa model, yield nothing forward, defend in depth from prepared positions, bleed the attackers as expensively as possible, was being applied to an island that was orders of magnitude larger than Okinawa, with a civilian population that had been told to arm itself with bamboo spears. The casualty calculation that Okinawa produced was not complicated arithmetic. The 10th Army had suffered approximately 150 American dead per day across 82 days of combat. Operation Olympic's projected combat duration was 90 to 120 days, in terrain and against a force of roughly 3 times the scale, with a civilian population instructed to resist. The per-day casualty rate applied to those variables produced figures that the planning documents tried to bracket between conservative and pessimistic estimates and couldn't keep below the level of catastrophe. The Secretary of War, Henry Stimson, had access to these projections through the Interim Committee, the body advising on the use of the atomic weapon, and the Interim Committee's meeting notes from the summer of 1945 reference what they call the Okinawa experience, with enough frequency that the connection between the battle and the decision is explicit in the primary source record. Japan's own planning for the defense of Kyushu, Operation Ketsugo, had, by July of 1945, assembled a force of kamikaze aircraft that dwarfs what was deployed at Okinawa. Where the Okinawa campaign saw approximately 1,465 dedicated kamikaze sorties, the plans for the Kyushu defense called for 5,350 kamikaze aircraft, plus approximately 3,300 of the rocket-powered Oka-manned bombs that had been produced but barely used at Okinawa. If the Okinawa kamikaze campaign had killed 4,907 American sailors and brought serious discussion of fleet withdrawal, the mathematics of scaling that force by a factor of 4 is not reassuring arithmetic to anyone who was counting in the summer of 1945. The calculation wasn't secret. It was in the intelligence estimates. The people making the decision about the atomic weapon had access to it. Now, I want to be honest about the historiographical debate here, because it's real and it's unresolved, and it touches directly on Okinawa's place in this story. Gar Alperovitz, in his 1995 study of the atomic bomb decision, argues that the casualty projections were deliberately constructed to justify a decision made primarily on geopolitical grounds. Specifically, the desire to end the war before Soviet entry into the Pacific gave Moscow leverage over Japan's post-war political settlement. Richard Frank, in his 1999 book Downfall, argues that the projections were good faith estimates from Okinawa data, and that the Japanese Ketsu-go preparations, which American codebreakers were reading in real time, made them credible rather than inflated. I've worked through both arguments carefully, and my honest position is that both contain elements of truth that the other fails to fully accommodate. The geopolitical calculation was real. The casualty projection was also real, and the Okinawa data that produced it was solid. Whether the decision would have been made differently if the geopolitical calculation had been absent is a counterfactual that no archive can answer. The B-29 campaign against Japanese cities that preceded the atomic strikes had, by the summer of 1945, already killed more civilians than either atomic bomb would. The March firebombing of Tokyo alone, in a single night, had killed somewhere between 80,000 and 100,000 people. The atomic weapon was not entering a war that had been conducted with restraint up to that point. It was entering a war that had already exceeded, on multiple occasions, any definition of restraint that the term had previously contained. This context doesn't resolve the moral question of the atomic decision. It does complicate the framing, common in retrospective argument, that imagines the atomic bomb as a departure from something more contained. The departure, if it occurred, had been accumulating for years. The Japanese civilian population was, by the summer of 1945, in a state of material deprivation that the American strategic bombing campaign and the naval blockade had produced with methodical thoroughness. Food was rationed at levels below minimum nutritional adequacy in many parts of the country. Industrial production had been severely degraded. The shipping that connected Japan's home islands to the raw material sources that sustained its economy was largely gone. In this context, the Japanese government's decision to continue resistance, to implement Ketsu-go, to train civilians with bamboo weapons, to plan for a defense of the homeland that its own military planners projected would cost millions of lives, is one of the most consequential decisions made by any government in the 20th century. The decision to continue is usually framed in terms of military honor and institutional momentum. Both are accurate characterizations. Neither fully explains how rational people, in possession of accurate information about their country's military and economic situation, could look at the projected cost of continued resistance and authorize it. Okinawa provides a partial answer. Ushijima's strategy had been designed precisely to show the Americans what continued resistance would cost. The people in Tokyo had watched it work. They intended to apply it at scale to the home islands. They believed the Americans might blink. They were wrong. The atomic bombs on Hiroshima on the 6th of August and Nagasaki on the 9th of August, 1945, killed somewhere between 130,000 and 226,000 people, with significant uncertainty at both ends of the range. Japan surrendered on the 15th of August. The planned invasion of Kyushu, the battle for which Okinawa had been the final rehearsal, the final calibration, the source of all the arithmetic in the Joint War Plans Committee tables, never happened. The 767,000 assault troops who were being assembled for Olympic spent the autumn of 1945 as an occupation force rather than an invasion force. They got to go home. The Okinawans, whose island had been used as the laboratory for a calculation that produced all of this, did not go anywhere. They stayed on what was left of their island under American administration and began trying to understand what had happened to them. Chapter 17. The island remembers Okinawa's unfinished history. The 23rd of June, 2025. Peace Memorial Park, Itaman City, Southern Okinawa. The 80th anniversary ceremony. Granite panels extend in curved rows across a hillside that faces the Pacific. The cornerstone of peace, a monument whose design places every name on the same level, in the same material, without hierarchy of nationality or rank or which side the named person was fighting for. More than 241,000 names are inscribed here. Japanese soldiers and Okinawan civilians and American sailors and Marines and Army infantry and Korean laborers who were brought to the island against their will and died there. The newest names were added in 2022, part of a periodic review process that continues to identify individuals whose deaths in the campaign had not previously been formally recorded. The granite panels have space for more names. The review process continues. The monument is not finished. The 80th anniversary ceremony was attended by Okinawa's prefectural governor, Denny Tamaki, by a representative of the Japanese Prime Minister's office, by the American ambassador to Japan, and by representatives of the Himayuri Survivors Association, the last living members of the Student Nursing Corps, whose story occupied an earlier chapter of this documentary. The survivors of the Himayuri Corps, who are still living, are in their mid to late 90s. They attend the ceremony in ever smaller numbers each year. The testimony they carry, the specific, particular, irreplaceable knowledge of what it meant to be 17 years old in an underground military hospital in 1945, is leaving the world at the rate of human mortality. And within a decade, it will be gone entirely, existing only in the oral history transcripts and the museum exhibits and the school curricula of an island that has spent 80 years deciding what to do with what happened to it. The American military presence on Okinawa in 2025 and 2026 is not a historical artifact. It is an active, contested, and strategically significant fact of the present. Approximately 18% of Okinawa's main island is occupied by United States military facilities. The headquarters of 3rd Marine Expeditionary Force, Camp Courtney, Camp Foster, Kadena Air Base, Marine Corps Air Station Futenma, and a network of smaller installations. Approximately 26,000 American military personnel are stationed there. The Futenma Airfield, located in the middle of a densely populated residential area in Ginowan City, has been the subject of relocation negotiations between the American and Japanese governments since 1996. 30 years of negotiation, producing an agreement to move the base to a new facility being built at Cape Henoko by filling in a portion of Ura Bay. As of early 2026, construction is ongoing. contested in the Japanese courts and in public demonstration, with no resolution in clear sight. The geopolitical logic that makes Okinawa strategically valuable, 340 miles from the Chinese coast, at the center of the first island chain that forms the basis of current American deterrence strategy in the Western Pacific, is identical to the logic that made it a 1945 invasion target. The Marine Littoral Regiment, activated at Camp Courtney in 2023, is a unit whose operational concept was designed specifically for the strategic environment of the Western Pacific, and I find it impossible to describe without noting the historical echo. The regiment is configured for dispersed, mobile operations across island terrain, with an emphasis on anti-ship missile systems and the ability to operate within the weapons range of a peer adversary's air and surface forces. It is, in the most direct functional sense, the tactical inverse of Ushijima's 32nd Army, a force designed not to hold fixed positions against an overwhelming assault, but to move and disperse and impose costs on an advancing force through distributed fire. It is Yahara's geometry inverted, deployed by the country that Yahara's geometry was designed to bleed. The island that was the site of the greatest attritional land battle in Pacific War history is now the base for a unit whose doctrine tries to prevent the conditions that made that battle possible from recurring. The textbook controversy that I described in the outline for this documentary has had a recent chapter. In 2023, a new Japanese national curriculum review raised questions about the characterization of the battle in mainland versus Okinawan educational materials. The same tension that produced the 110,000-person protest demonstration of 2007. The specific language at issue changes with each review cycle, but the underlying question doesn't. Whose narrative of what happened on this island carries official authority? And what does that narrative include about the relationship between Japanese military decisions and Okinawan civilian deaths? The Okinawan prefectural government's position on this question has been consistent for decades. The civilian deaths were not simply the tragic collateral cost of an honorable military defense. They were, in significant part, the consequence of specific decisions made by specific people. And the historical record that Okinawan students are taught should reflect that. The mainland Japanese government's position has over multiple curriculum cycles oscillated between acknowledgement and evasion. The argument is ongoing. It matters because the people having it are trying to decide what this battle means. Not in 1945, but now in classrooms, due to teenagers who will carry whatever understanding they receive forward into the next 80 years. When I think about what makes the cornerstone of peace unusual as a war memorial, not just in Japan, but globally, the design decision I keep returning to is the one that generated the most controversy when the monument was proposed in the early 1990s. The decision to place every name on the same panels, without separation by nationality or allegiance. American veterans groups objected to Japanese military names, appearing alongside their fallen comrades. Japanese nationalist groups objected to Okinawan civilian names being mixed with Japanese military names on the grounds that it implied moral equivalence between combatants and non-combatants. The Okinawan government, under Governor Masahide Ota, considered both objections and rejected them. The monument was built as proposed. Every name is on the same stone, in the same size lettering, in the same granite. The Japanese language has a different tradition of memorial alphabetization than the Latin alphabet does, but the structural principle is the same. Within the panels, everyone is equal. The Americans and the Japanese and the Okinawans and the Koreans are arranged without hierarchy. Because the Okinawan government decided that the most honest statement about what happened on this island was that the distinction between victors and vanquished, between perpetrators and victims, was not as clean as separate panels would suggest. To me, having spent considerable time in these archives over the period of this documentary's research, the Cornerstone's design choice feels like the most historically accurate decision anyone has made about Okinawa since the battle ended. Not because it resolves the moral questions, it doesn't, and it doesn't try to, but because it refuses to pretend that the categories are as clear as monuments usually require them to be. The American sailor at Picket Station Number 1, who was killed by a kamikaze attack designed with technical precision to exploit a sensor gap, is on those panels. So is the Japanese pilot who flew the mission. So is the Okinawan schoolteacher whose diary ended in April of 1945. So by design is Corporal Smith, HL, the fireman's second class whose name appeared in an action report from 1945, and who sealed a fire room hatch on a burning destroyer, and whose name I have been carrying through this documentary since the 5th chapter. He is there. He is counted. The conversation that Okinawa keeps having with itself, about the bases, about the textbooks, about the memorial, about the political relationship between the island and the mainland, Japanese government that conscripted its young people and armed its civilians with grenades in 1945, is not a conversation that has arrived at a conclusion. It's a conversation that is continuing in the prefectural assembly and in the demonstrations at Camp Schwab's perimeter fence, and in the classrooms where teachers are working with curricula that different levels of government have approved for different purposes. The island is, in this sense, still negotiating with the battle that was fought on it 8 decades ago, still deciding what obligation the living carry to the dead, and which dead, and in whose name. Okinawa was never simply a military objective. It was a place where people lived. Ryukyuan people with a distinct language and culture and history that predated both Japanese sovereignty and American interest by centuries. The Kingdom of Ryukyu, whose castle provided the tunnel complex for the 32nd Army's headquarters, had been an independent maritime civilization for 500 years, before Japan absorbed it in 1879. The culture that the castle represented, the Nakoshi stonework, the distinctive textile traditions, the Uchinaguchi language that is not Japanese, but related to it the way a cousin is related to a sibling, survived the battle, barely, carried through the caves and the drainage channels and the underground hospitals by the people who were hiding in them. That survival was not guaranteed. The casualty range that I cited in the 9th chapter, 40,000 to 150,000 civilians, represents, at its upper estimate, roughly 1 in 3 Okinawans alive before the battle. 1 in 3. The cornerstone of peace stands at the southern tip of the island, on the Mabuni hill mass, the same ground where Ushijima died, where the 32nd Army's last positions were, where the battle ended. It faces the Pacific, which is an ocean that knows nothing about any of this and will continue long after the granite weathers and the names become difficult to read. The monument was designed so that additional names could be added indefinitely. The review process that finds them continues. In 2022, names were added. There will be more. The accounting is not finished. 80 years after the battle, the island is still counting its dead, and the number keeps changing, and the granite is still there, waiting to receive whatever the counting finds. The battle for Okinawa lasted 82 days and consumed more than 240,000 lives. It produced the arithmetic that drove the atomic decision that ended the Pacific War. It produced the logistical and tactical lessons that still inform American military planning for the same body of water 8 decades later. It produced a memorial that puts every name on the same stone. And it produced, in the Okinawan civilian experience, a weight of historical memory that has not been fully integrated into the versions of this story that the countries involved have most often preferred to tell. The archive is there. The testimonies are there. The names are in the granite. The accounting is incomplete, and the island knows it, and the island keeps going.